In one of the valleys of Nirim, where a high mountain was located, there was heavy snow. It shone brightly in the air and on the branches of trees under the glow of the full moon. A group of people was traveling along a snow-covered path in a dense forest among deciduous trees. Some of them carried the necessary cargo, or illuminated the road. One man was riding a horse. A man walking ahead turned to him. He asked Mr. M if he would stop them here for the night, as it was almost dark. M replied that they don't have time for that. Hearing his master's words, the man turned to face the rest and announced that he must move faster, as he must get to Hangzhou today. People were not very happy with this schedule of events. They walked straight, not paying attention to the fact that it was already dark. Thick wet snow flew into their faces. A group of people just approached the bridge that had to be crossed. Suddenly, Mr. M's horse began to jerk and kick. He definitely did not want to cross this bridge, as he felt the danger there. M's guide was surprised by the horse's actions and turned to his master. M asked if something suddenly happened up ahead, as his horse doesn't usually behave like this. The men began to peer into the darkness to see something. The guide noticed a strange man ahead and pointed at him. A young man stood right in the middle of the bridge, blocking the way for travelers. His head was lowered and he was looking at the floor. The guide told him to get out of the way. The man did not like these words very much. He raised his head slightly to look at the people in front of him. His gaze was cold and eerie. He did not move from his place for a single step, continuing to stand on the bridge. The guide decided that it was just some crazy person and was going to deal with him. Suddenly the man on the bridge began to move. He smoothly lifted his right leg off the ground, and was about to do something. The leader shouted to the other brothers to pay attention to this. He carefully followed the man's movements, but could not understand what he was doing. He was surprised by the smooth movements of the boy, despite the fact that he was quite thin. The guide decided not to take any action in this situation, and simply told the man opposite to look elsewhere for his tricks. At that moment, Mr. M noticed something strange, and told his guide to be careful. The man's name was Huang Ji, and he did not understand what his master wanted from him. The boy who had been standing motionless on the bridge suddenly moved behind Huang, and cut off his hand. Huang didn't even have time to understand what had just happened. He slowly lowered his head and noticed a lot of blood in the area of his shoulder where the arm was gone. The other warriors stood with their mouths wide open and also did not understand anything. They only saw blood and screamed loudly from such horror. Mr. M was more worried than anyone because he knew he was being hunted. He mentally asked himself how it was that no one even noticed the sword strike. M's wards decided not to wait long, because it was not safe to stand still. One of them shouted that he should be stopped, and urged the rest to attack the enemy. This did not scare the man at all. Even now he stood still in one place, with his head down. Hearing the screams of his enemies, a demonic smile appeared on his face. One of the soldiers noticed that the enemy was smiling, and this greatly alarmed the man. He didn't understand exactly what that meant, but it was definitely nothing good. Mr. M's wards rushed into battle, encroaching on the territory of the bridge. Their enemy just stood there, as if waiting for them in his territory. One of the soldiers, who was the first to move towards the man on the bridge, tried to pierce him with the sword. But the man deftly dodged and grabbed the sword from his opponent. Avoiding the enemy's attack, he struck the enemy's neck with all his strength. He cut off his head with a bullet that flew a couple of meters away from the battle site. Having dealt with one more of his enemies, the man straightened up to his full height and looked in the direction of the still living opponents. It was obvious from his look what he would do next. Mr. M and his wards standing nearby were shocked by what had just happened. Fear and nothing else could be seen on their faces. All the soldiers standing in front of this man were scared to death. M concluded that this boy was undoubtedly involved in the brutal murder in Mirima. He remembered that there had been talk of an attack by brutal killers who looked exactly like his enemy. He decided to jump off his horse and start taking action. Landing on the ground and surrounded by his wards, Mr. M drew his sword from its sheath and ordered everyone to retreat. All the soldiers were shocked by such a decision of their master. The man stood silently on the bridge and looked towards his enemies. He heard the orders of the chief of his opponents, and was waiting to see what he would do. M drew his sword from its scabbard with a loud creaking sound. He turned to his enemy and said, "He will pay for that. He is going to crush everyone here." Im's wards weren't going to stand idly by there. They were charged with the mood of their leader and rushed to the attack with the words that they needed to protect their master. The man again cut off the head of the first warrior who dared to approach him. One of the warriors ordered to capture this man and added that they could defeat him if they all attacked together. The man on the bridge was standing with his hand clenched into a left fist. A severed head lay under his feet, and the screams of others could be heard from all sides from this phenomenon. Im was furious at what the enemy had done to his charges. He clenched his teeth as hard as he could and was going to finish off the offender. His face radiated confidence and fierce anger. The warriors continued to attack, but fell to the ground one by one. With the rest, the man killed everyone who dared to stand in his way. He enjoyed killing people. A small town was located in another Murim valley. The day was cold and cloudy, but in spite of all this, there were enough people in the bazaar. From one of the plots, which was located in the central square, 2 men were carried out in sacks. One of them said aloud that the owner of the house was very generous to them. The men continued to talk about the owner of the house, who provided them with rice to build strength for the new year. An old man standing on the side confirmed that after Mr. Baiwan became the head of the family, everyone's fear of starvation disappeared. But the discussion of good news for the population was interrupted by another man with a bag on his shoulder. He said that Mr. M was said to have been killed recently. Another man was shocked by such news. On their way home, the men continued to discuss the news that was spreading around the town. One of them said that those who oppose Huang Bo's family may die. Another replied that it was not true as Mr. Baiwan was a nice person. At that moment, a man in a yellow robe was watching them. Suddenly, he was interrupted by a young man who turned to his master. He said that Manim wanted to see him. The man was surprised, but went after the young man. Having brought the man to the Manim, the young man reported that he had brought the man to the house. The woman turned her head towards the door the man had just entered. She rushed to the man asking where he was when they were looking for him. The woman said that guests would be arriving soon, and it would be impolite if the man was absent. The gentleman approached the woman and asked what had happened to her, and why she had such a gloomy expression on her face. The man added that the woman should take her time with the answer and tell him honestly. He asked if she sometimes hides something from him. The woman was shocked by such a question, which left her in a stupor. She asked in response what the man was talking about. The man felt uncertainty in the woman's words. Making his face more serious, he asked if she knew about the recent murders and for what reason these people died. The woman felt awkward under the pressure of her husband. She pursed her lips, raised her hand to her chest, and tried to squeeze out at least one word. Pan added that even in the town they are already transplanted, that it is somehow related to Huang Bo, and said that there is a measure to everything, even if it was done for the sake of their family. The man did not have time to finish his disgruntled story when the woman interrupted him. She clearly cut off that she clearly understood what Mr. was leading to. She approached him not behind his back and put her hand on his shoulder. The woman said that she had foreseen everything in advance, and had already prepared everything to make amends. In the dark forest, almost at midnight, women's cries of fear rang out. The words of men were also heard from behind the stone, wondering how fast this woman was. 3 men were chasing a lone girl who was running away from them with all her might. One of the men said that it was the first time he had seen such a fast and agile girl. Others also agreed with these words. Realizing that it would be difficult to catch up with the woman, and it would take a lot of time, one of the men threw an axe in the direction of the young woman to stop her. The axe flew at the level of the girl's circle and caught the skin, spilling blood. The woman was shocked to see blood on her legs. She fell to the ground from the wound, and 3 men were already standing over her, praising her beauty. They called her a deserved victim for the one who knocked her down. The girl ordered not to approach her. The men insisted that the girl would go to the one who impressed her, and it was really time for him to get a girl. The man did not object to his partners and was going to take the woman into his hands. Suddenly, the men heard strange sounds not far from them. The young man was carrying a bag that rustled in his hands, which attracted the attention of strangers. This was the same guy who single-handedly slaughtered an entire group of warriors. He attracted the attention of men who mocked the girl lying under the Christmas tree. While the men tried to figure out among themselves who it was and why he just came by, the girl had time to rest and think. She decided to call for help as hard as she could. But the men didn't pay any attention to her. They noticed that the young man was carrying a bag that must have something in it. They decided to take this thing from a passerby and pounced on him from different sides. The young man did not pay any attention to the actions of the men and went on. When the robber's hands almost touched the young man's body, he accelerated sharply and avoided a collision with the robbers. The men did not understand how it happened in the first place. They took out their axes and talked about how this skinny guy was a lot faster than he looked. They wanted to watch him stand before the axe. 2 men rushed towards the young man to kill him with axes. This time they let out very loud screams that were impossible not to hear. Of course, the young man heard them. He raised his eyes at the last moment, preparing to parry the attack of his abusers. As soon as the robbers could already see their axes in the young man's body, he cut them with his attack. Everything happened so fast that the men did not have time to do anything about it. The young man threw the bag, which the robbers wanted to take from him, on the ground. The bag opened a little and someone's hair could be seen there. The 2 robbers fell to the ground, covered in rivers of blood from the attacker's blow. The third sat over their bodies. At first, he did not realize what had happened and tried to talk to his teammates. Realizing that the enemy hit them with 1 blow, and they would no longer survive, the man raised his head. He noticed the bag in front of him that he wanted to steal just a few seconds ago. But now his desire has completely disappeared. He saw someone's severed head in the bag, which was bleeding. The young man approached the man, who was sitting on the cold ground and was shaking with fear, and asked him to give him his bag, which was lying on the floor. At this moment, the man was already holding the bag in his hand and was still trembling in the face of death. The young man was not going to wait long for his bag, and in a second he got rid of the man's head on his shoulders. The woman was still sitting on the ground near the tree as she could not get up due to her injuries. Seeing the severed head, she called for help again. The young man came closer to the girl and, tying his bag with his head, asked if the woman saw anything of what happened. She said no out of fear of losing her life. The man turned away from the girl. She sat motionless on the ground, her heart almost jumping out of her chest at that moment. The woman did not want to die like this. She stared without looking away at the man in front of her. She did not believe that he would just take it and believe her, and leave her alone. A drop of rain fell on the young man's right ear. Just a second ago, the sky was cloudless with a full moon. The woman was surprised by the raindrops that began to fall on her as well. She was shocked by such rainfall as it was not the rainy season. There was snow on the trees, which literally just sparkled under the moonlight. Now his peace was interrupted by his younger brother the rain. The woman was looking at the thin young man's figure from behind. He was standing with a bag in his hands. Several more of his victims were lying under his feet, and his face looked really demonic. The man's eyes opened wide. He was shocked at where he found himself. His body felt unbearable pain at this moment. Looking up, the man saw a water-sharpened stone in front of him, from which an incomprehensible liquid dripped directly onto his face. He found himself in some afterlife. His body was completely naked and was in a stream of blood. Human skeletons were suspended above his head. The man was horrified by the sounds coming from all sides. He heard incomprehensible voices that cut into his ears. Turning around, the man saw the red eyes of the dead. His body was up to his neck in a lake of blood, at the bottom of which lay thousands of lost souls. Their faces were as if they were still alive and calling for help. In the real world, the man felt even greater fear and pain. Raindrops were running down his face. He grabbed his face with both hands and screamed loudly. The woman was completely shocked by this. She was filled with emotions, among which fear prevailed. She slowly crawled away from the man who was holding his head with his hands. Suddenly she felt someone's presence behind her. Such events alarmed her greatly, and she decided to turn her head to check what was happening behind her. Turning around, the girl saw the figure of a thin man standing right in front of her and looking into her eyes. There was nothing in his eyes, they looked as if a man had risen from the dead. The woman was very frightened by the man's gaze. She crawled across the ground away from his figure, keeping her eyes on him, until she hit a tree trunk. the man approached her. He slowly and confidently approached the woman, keeping his head motionless on her shoulders. There was no emotion on his face. The girl understood that this look did not mean anything good. She closed her eyes so as not to see all the horrors and screamed loudly from hopelessness. For some time, nothing happened and the girl did not understand anything. She decided to open her eyes to make sure that nothing was happening. Opening her eyes fully, the girl saw that the man who had just wanted to finish her off had simply become restless. He fell limply on top of her, resting on her knee. The girl was shocked by such a turn of events, but at the same time pleased. Nothing threatened her life now, and she could breathe a sigh of relief. It was almost dusk in the yard. The sun slowly began to sink behind the sky, throwing its last rays through the surrounding clouds and the leaves of the trees. The man lay unconscious on the ground for some time. His body cooled from the temperature around him. He finally opened his eyes and came to. Completely upset, he raised his head and saw in front of him a woman who was making a fire. She asked him if he finally woke up. The man saw potential danger in the woman sitting next to the fire. We'd got to his feet and was going to attack her immediately so that she wouldn't tell anyone. Seeing the young man's intentions, the girl tried to calm him down. She said that she was about to leave him, but since he saved her, she decided to warm him up a little. The man did not pay attention to the words of the woman who told him the confession about tonight. He turned his head in different directions a couple of times, looking for something. While the man clenched his fist with his right hand, the girl realized that the man was looking for his bag, and pointed to the place where it was. The young man felt embarrassed because he almost attacked an innocent girl. Drops of sweat appeared on his face from the feeling of discomfort. The girl took the man's look negatively, and got scared again. She threw her hands up and shouted that she hadn't even touched his bag. When the girl opened her eyes, she saw something strange in front of her. A drop of sweat fell from her face, which was the result of fear. The woman saw an empty place in front of her. The man suddenly disappeared without saying or doing anything. He took with him only a bag that was lying under a tree. The man set off again. He passed by a small town in which snow was falling, sweeping all the paths around. The young man decided that he needed to rest a little and warm up in a warm place. Therefore, he chose one of the haunts where he could sit quietly. He slowly opened the door to the establishment and entered there. Along with him came the wind, the force of which caused the door to creak unpleasantly. The tables in the building were empty. No one sat down until night. The young man looked around, looking for a place where he could sit more comfortably. Suddenly, an old man approached him, who greeted him and invited him to pass and sit wherever he wanted. He ran this run today. The young man sat down at one of the tables and put his bag next to him. The old man quickly approached him and brought him a drink. There was only a bottle and a glass on the tray. As soon as the old man approached the table where the guest was sitting, he suddenly noticed a strange bag with blood stains on it. This seemed suspicious and strange to the man. The young man asked if this man was the owner of this establishment. The old man quickly looked away from the bag so as not to look like a fool, and said that the owner was away on business. He offered the guest a menu, inviting the guest to take the paper from his hands. The man watched in silence, and was in no hurry to pick up the menu. He said that he wanted meat manga. The old man laughed awkwardly, scratching the back of his head. He approved the guest's choice and told him that he would have to wait a while. He went to the kitchen to prepare the guest's order. On the way to the door to another room, the old man constantly looked around, looking incredulously at the young man sitting at the table. The room to which this man was heading was not a kitchen at all. With a tray in his hands, he entered the door, where soldiers in black masks were waiting for him. There were unconscious people on the floor. One of the masked warriors stood over a bound woman who was kneeling, holding a sword at her throat. The old man said that the one who visited them was the same man. This man was standing right in the middle of the room, wondering what to do next. He was surrounded by dozens of warriors in black masks who had recently dealt with the people lying on the floor. The man took the dish he was supposed to bring to the guest. With a tray in his hands, he headed for the exit to the hall, and had already apologized earlier for making the man wait. But as soon as he opened his eyes, the body of one of his soldiers was lying in front of him, covered in blood. He was completely shocked by such a schedule of events. A guest who visited his establishment got ahead of his plans and found his secret room first. He dealt with one opponent and stood in the doorway. The old man did not expect to see the young man here. He suddenly panicked, shouted loudly and ordered to kill the man who came in here. The soldiers heard the order and rushed to attack the enemy. Each of them drew a sword, although one of them had to cut the throat of the opponent who had just killed their partner. The warriors dealt a double blow to the enemy, trying to cut his head from his shoulders. But the young man was ready for this and masterfully avoided the attack of his opponents. Dodging a double sword strike, the man extended both of his arms in the direction of the enemies and hit them with a ranged strike. Another enemy was approaching the man from the side, running towards him with a sword in his hand. The young man saw everything and, taking a fighting stance, prepared for resistance. He still managed to deliver another long-range blow, which landed on the right side of the enemy. The warrior did not expect to be overtaken by a remote attack and could not do anything. All the soldiers who were just about to finish off the uninvited guest were knocked to the ground. They flew away from the counterattack of the enemy, and the old man watched all this from the side. He was in complete shock and stood there with his mouth wide open. He did not understand how this was even possible. The warrior who held the sword at the woman's throat ordered the young man to stand where he was, otherwise the woman would die. She, in turn, said that nothing would work out for them, since the young man grew up to be wild animals. A hideous smile appeared on her face, and she added that if they want, they can kill her, but you can't take a husband so easily, and in this way they will all die together. The young man stood opposite and listened to this whole dialogue. His demonic gaze pierced the face of the enemy who wanted to kill the captive woman. The masked warrior noticed that the enemy was approaching. He brought the sword closer to the woman's throat, and said that if the young man took even one more step, she would die. The old man who met the guest at the establishment bent down on the floor to pick up the weapon. He turned around for a second and ordered his ward that if the woman twitched, she could be killed. Taking the sword from the ground in his right hand, the old man rose to his full height and stood opposite the young man. He was going to end him and said that he would end right now. He knew that the boy across from him would not be able to do anything to him, as he would want to save the woman's life. Therefore, the old man slowly approached the young man and waved his sword in front of his face. The old man took his time and struck rather slowly. The young man, in turn, was not going to die so easily. At the last moment he decided to act. The boy's actions shocked the enemy, who had just delivered a blow that was supposed to finish off the enemy. Having seen everything with his own eyes, the old man sweated from fear and surprise. The boy in front of him dodged his attack in an unusual way. He gripped the blade of the sword that was about to cut his throat with his teeth, making some not-so-pleasant noises. With his right hand, the man broke the blades of the enemy's sword. The old man was completely shocked by the fact that the advantage was definitely not on his side now. Without thinking for a long time, the young man delivered a blow of terrible force and lightning speed right into the enemy's nose with his right hand. The old man's face at the time of the impact could have resembled an omelette. The blade of the sword, which the young man cut off with his own hand, flew away. But even here the man calculated everything. The shard landed directly on the head of the warrior who was about to stab the woman. Blood started pouring from his head and he immediately fell to the ground. The woman was able to get out of the cruel clutches of her enemies and get up from her knees. All she was wearing was a rope. She turned to the enemy, who was lying on the floor and holding his nose, and in a confident voice asked who sent them here. The young man, who struck him in the nose, approached his victorious opponent and took him by the hair. He looked him straight in the eyes, and the old man began to shake in fright. He was pulled by the hair. He was in a hopeless situation, but he also predicted such a schedule of events. The old man removed his hand, which he used to cover his nose and mouth, and shouted with all his might, ordering to shoot. Not even a second passed, as the first arrow already pierced the glass in the building and flew to kill the enemy. The arrow was smeared with oil and set on fire to do more damage to the enemy. The arrow found its target and hit the heart of the woman standing opposite the window. She was tied with a rope, so she could not do anything and evade the attack. The young man was still holding the old man's hair. He thought that the blow would be aimed at him, but literally a second later he saw an arrow in the body of another person. He was very angry with the enemy who gave the order to open fire. He clenched his hair in his fist, and with his free fist he once again decided to teach the offender a lesson. Then the boy rushed to help the injured woman. She did not have time to fall to the floor, as the young man picked her up right in the air. She sighed heavily from the pain in her chest. Almost at the edge of the arrow, something flammable was placed to prevent the arrow from being pulled out. But this did not stop the boy. He took his hand directly to the burning place and pulled the arrow out of the woman's body, breaking it. He turned his head in the direction of the attack. Smoke was coming from his right hand, which was accompanied by an unpleasant smell, and behind him sat a woman who had just been shot. The young man saw an open window in front of him and immediately understood where the flight had come from. He looked at the roof of the neighboring house and tried to see someone there. Soldiers in black masks were sitting on the roof of this building. They sat down and drew their bows, preparing to attack. One of the soldiers was frightened by the look of the young man who looked at them from the window. The leader of the shooters shouted at the top of his lungs that it was necessary to attack right now. Immediately after his words, burning arrows flew at the enemy, at least one of which was supposed to kill the man. But the young man had other plans for this. He wasn't about to expose his body as a naked target for his enemies to see. He got into a fighting stance and repelled the joint attack of the enemies with a shock wave. On the roof of one of the houses, in one of the valleys of Mirim, the warriors in black masks continued to shoot burning arrows at their enemy, trying to hit him. Each arrow was either deflected by the boy's ranged attack or flew past his body, which was now closing in on its enemies. Suddenly, 3 arrows together hit the target, which was moving very fast. They got stuck halfway through the target, which they hit right on the move. The warriors watched their attack hit the enemy in the air. They were surprised that even such a simple shot could hit the target. Before their eyes was the figure of a man with arrows sticking out of his body, and a river of blood was flowing from his face. But everything was not as simple as the soldiers thought. As they watched their stricken target, loud shouts were heard behind them and they turned in that direction, and the soldiers were completely shocked by what they saw. Before their eyes stood the half-naked youth they had just killed, holding their partner by the head, taking his life. There was no time to delay, so one of the warriors immediately reached behind his back with his right hand to get the arrow. He could not allow the enemy to reach them, but it was already too late. The man got as close as possible to his next opponents, and hit one of them with his bare hand right in the chest. With his left hand, the young man made a hole in the body of his enemy. It looked terrible and caused fear in the other warrior who watched the blood flow from his fellow man's body. The man turned to him and asked who sent them here. There were drops of blood on his face that had only recently reached the surface. The warrior stood immovably in his place and looked into the eyes of the enemy. He wasn't going to say anything, and the skinny young man understood that, so he decided to do something. He raised his left hand covered in blood, showing his intentions. Literally a second later, that hand was in his enemy's mouth. The warrior could not find anything to do. The young man took hold of his opponent's tooth and yanked it with all his might. Taking his hand out of his mouth, the boy was already holding the extracted tooth in it. The enemy screamed in pain. The man continued to stand his ground and again asked who the customer was. The enemy was sitting on the roof, holding his mouth, and could not utter a word. The young man decided that his enemy was not going to tell anything yet. Then he picked up a stone that was lying near his foot and put it right into his opponent's mouth. Not seeing any sign that the enemy intended to tell everything, the man decided to continue his torture. He raised his fist in the air and squeezed it even harder. Then the young man delivered a lightning strike that landed right in the enemy's face. He struck such a powerful blow, the stone in the warrior's mouth cracked, and his teeth flew in different directions. The young man continued to stand over the worthless body of his enemy and beat the crap out of his head. He delivered a few more accurate blows to the opponent's temple. As a result of such actions, another couple of teeth fell out of the warrior's mouth. They fell directly onto the roof of the building, accompanied by the release of saliva from their mouths. The man stopped to question his opponent and stood over him, waiting to hear something. From the lips of the enemy, who was beaten to the point of blood, came a request to stop all this. But the young man was not going to stop until they knew everything he needed. He again took the beaten warrior by the head and was going to continue his torture. The enemy asked to wait, and took something from his bosom that was supposed to save his life. The boy stopped, and noticed that the enemy wanted to give him something. He took the thing that the enemy gave him in order not to die. It was a golden sign that symbolized one of the clans. The young man noticed that the woman, who had been hit by an arrow, was a little wobbly and came closer. He held the trophy up so she could see it too. Looking at the golden sign, the woman concluded that it was Huang Bo's name plate. Blood pouring from her mouth, she added that it turns out that he is behind all this. The warrior, who had lost almost all of his teeth a few seconds ago, took out a sharp knife from his bosom. He realized that he had made a mistake and wanted to quickly correct it. Holding the knife firmly in his right hand, the warrior rushed to attack his enemy with loud shouts. The young man stood motionless in his place and watched the toothless enemy. As soon as the enemy began to think that he was about to hit the man, the latter grabbed the sharp part of the weapon with his hand, stopping the enemy's attack. The warrior in the black mask, from which only rags remained on his face, was in shock. The young man pointed the drawn knife straight into the opponent's face, which greatly frightened the latter. With all his might, he made a final stab with the knife right in the face of the enemy, because he knew that he had learned everything he wanted from him. During the pain of the battle, rivers of blood were shed several times. It was almost dawn outside. The sun's rays brightly illuminated the remnants of snow on grass, plants, and trees, the peace of which was disturbed by the wind. This wind came from a boy who was moving forward carrying a wounded woman on his shoulders. They had already spent a couple of hours on the road, but they had little time to linger. The woman on the young man's shoulder began to sigh and blood gushed from her mouth again. In a low voice, she asked her rescuer to stop for a rest. The guy took the woman off his back and put her on the ground. The boy's back was bleeding from the woman's wound, and she herself sat down on the floor, leaning on a rock. Having seated the woman more comfortably so that she could rest, the young man left her for a moment to be alone. He also needed rest, which he spent collecting leaves on the ground. The woman barely held on to keep from fainting. The young man, having collected leaves on the ground, put them on a stone and was going to grind them, making a certain medicinal mixture. Having made this medicinal mixture, the boy began to apply the leaves to the fatal wound on the woman's body. Spitting out blood, she said that it would not help her. She took the young man's hand, as if stopping him. The woman's face was dripping with sweat from unbearable pain. She no longer felt anything but him and said that her time had come. The young man looked at the woman sitting in front of him with anger in his eyes. He was angry with her because he did not understand how she could say goodbye to life so easily and abandon it. The guy decided not to waste a second and still tried to save the injured woman's life. He tore off a piece of fabric from his pants that was supposed to help him with this. Wrapping the fabric around the woman's chest, the guy sewed it tightly and tied it. The woman's eyes were closed, and all she could do at that moment was sigh. She found the strength to say the last words to the young man who was worried about her. She addressed him by name. The boy's name was Wonsu, and was about to continue. Through excruciating pain, the woman gave her speech that after her death, Wonsu would not return to Mage and live his life. The guy carefully watched and listened to the woman's words. After sitting for a couple of seconds and thinking about the above, Wonsu became upset. He closed his eyes and sank into his own thoughts. The woman added that if Huang Bo tried to kill them, then based on that Mage no longer needed them and did not respect them. Wonsu threw the tool he used to treat the woman on the floor. He could not come to terms with the fact that now his life would be completely different. Wonsu wanted to return home with the wounded woman, but this was not destined to happen. The woman took the boy's right hand and said that she was very sorry that it happened that way. Wonsu was never treated like a decent person, and in the end, they turned him down like this. The woman was going to say something else, but couldn't. The pain in her chest was excruciating and she began to cough, spitting up a lot of blood right in front of her. Wonsu was worried about the woman's health. He still could not believe that a woman was going to leave this world. He rose to his feet, trying to somehow help the wounded woman. The woman literally squeezed out every word that was worth every second of her life. She asked the young man once again that after her death he would start living for himself. Wonsu was not ready to let the woman go to the next world. His eyes showed concern not only for her, but also for his future fate in this world. As soon as he realized that the woman was no longer speaking or breathing, the young man fell powerlessly to his knees in front of her body. He really wanted to bring her back, but there was nothing he could do. Somewhere in this same valley, in a dense forest, there was an old manor house. It was surrounded by a straw fence behind which grew tall Christmas trees covered with snow. A girl who was recently attacked by robbers entered the small house. She greeted her father and informed him that she was back. The old father was lying in bed and jumped out when he saw his daughter. He asked what had happened to her, that her clothes were now torn. Approaching her father, the girl said that on the way she came across bandits who attacked her. The old man was very worried by his daughter's words. She smiled to reassure her father and said that she was fine because she had been saved by a passing warrior. And thanks to him, she was able to reach her home safely. The old man looked at his daughter and listened to her attentively. He was very scared for his native blood, because she could get into trouble. Father lowered his gaze to the floor, feeling guilty. He apologized to his daughter, whose name was Yeren, for not being a very good father. He added that if it were not for his illness, the girl would not have had to risk her life at such a young age. The daughter raised her finger to her father's mouth and asked him not to say that, since it is not his fault here, especially since she returned safe and sound. Yeren moved away from her father's bed and was going to go somewhere. She turned to face him, asked if he was hungry, and offered to prepare something to eat. Without waiting for an answer from her father, the girl left the house, holding her dress with her hands. The old man was confused, because he did not even have time to answer anything. At that time, in the area where the battle had recently taken place, a man found a tooth that Wonsu had pulled out of his enemy's mouth. He was still bleeding. The red-haired man who found this tooth held it in his right hand and examined it carefully. On his mantle was a gold pendant in the shape of a wolf. He arrived at the scene of the battle together with his wards, who were all wearing black suits and masks. The soldiers were armed to the teeth and carefully inspected the battle site. One of them found Wonsu's bag, which contained Huang Bo's head and gold mark. These were the main finds at a place where a difficult battle had recently taken place. The warrior brought this evidence to his mentor, who was a red-haired man with a beard. He looked carefully at the golden mark and concluded that the boy knew that they had carried out the attack. For some time the man lost his thoughts, scratching his red mustache. He concluded that if he knows everything, then it is impossible to leave the young man alive. The leader sat on his throne. Heavy snow was falling around his figure, and there was a strong wind blowing his mantle. The man said their enemy couldn't have gone too far. After a while, he gave the order to follow him. It was carried by 4 wards holding the throne. Other warriors were stationed on the sides, guarding their leader. Somewhere on the mountain in a wide valley among thick trees and bushes was a cave. It was a place where no one could enter. At the entrance, the cave is overgrown with sharp ends. In this inaccessible and hidden from human eyes in the city, the boy stood on his hands, and with his feet he held a plate filled with a liquid that was bubbling strongly. The young man was not alone, holding an incomprehensible plate with his heels. Many very young boys lined up, one after another, performing this difficult task. These events took place 20 years ago, when Vans was 12 years old. He was the young man who stood out the most from the others with his thin figure, which could barely stand on his hands. Minutes passed like hours for young Wonsu. He constantly sighed heavily from pain and inexplicable fear. Suddenly, his neighbor on the left could not withstand such a load and the bowl with liquid fell from his feet. The green liquid poured directly onto his face and body, and the bowl fell to the floor. The boy screamed terribly in pain. This liquid began to eat away at his skin, evaporating a disgusting steam. Wonsu was in complete shock. He did not expect that they are forced to keep such a poisonous mixture on their heels, from which people do not even survive. The injured boy's eyes came out of their sockets and popped out. Wonsu continued to watch his neighbor's torment with fear on his face. Sweat was dripping all over his body from what he saw. In front of him lay the boy's hand, which had just been separated from the body by a green caustic liquid. Wonsu's whole body suddenly began to shake from what he saw. Of course, this was not the only factor. The arms and legs also could not withstand the constant load. The bowl with the green mixture, which was standing on the heels of the young man, began to lean down. Drops of poisonous liquid began to drip onto the floor next to Once's hands, which scared the young man very much. He tried his best to maneuver his bare feet to hold the bowl and not spill the poison on himself. But the body refused to listen to him due to excessive fatigue. Suddenly Once heard a voice asking him if he wanted to die from his actions. Someone's hands quickly grabbed the young man's legs and straightened them so that the bowl was level. A woman was looking at Once's face and ordered him to stand straight. "This is her, the one for whom Once will risk his life 20 years later." The woman noticed in time that the young and thin young man was in danger of death. He stood out from the others because of his thinness, so the woman decided to help him. After the inhuman training, the future warriors sat in their resting place, their backs against the rock. Their faces were gloomy and lowered to the floor. Suddenly, their rest was interrupted by a voice announcing dinner. A dead pig was thrown right in front of the young men's faces. Once looked at the animal in front of him, and was not very happy. Almost all the boys got up from the floor to get a closer and more detailed look at their upcoming lunch. Their faces definitely did not see this dish as appetizing and radiated only disgust. But the young men understood that in such conditions, apart from dead animals, they had nothing else to eat. One of them ran as fast as he could to the dinner table, drooling as he went. He had almost reached his goal to stuff his stomach, but he was stopped by someone's hand, which grabbed his head and pulled him back, preventing him from feasting on the dead pig. He was a powerful bald young man who trained with the others in these inhumane conditions. He was stronger and stronger than the others, so he had an advantage. He easily stopped his partner. After he grabbed the young man's head, he smashed it into the stone floor with all his might. The young man's face flattened under the influence of such a powerful force. Stopping the young man, who was supposed to come to the dinner table first, the big man said that he would eat first. Then the bald man added that when he could eat his fill, the others could finish the leftovers. Having finished his warning to his vis-a-vis, the big man began to tear pieces of meat from the pig and swallow them without chewing. The other boys stood and watched it from the sidelines, waiting for their turn. No one could object to the pumped-up guy either, but not Vance. He was very angry with him because he knew that this was unfair not only to him but also to the rest of the young men. Clenching his teeth, Once bent down to pick up the rock from the ground. He was not satisfied with the situation, so he decided to correct it right now. Taking the stone in his right hand, Vance hit the head with more strength from the back. Blood began to spray from all sides, but it was unclear whether it was pig blood or human blood. Zdroven was shocked by this turn of events. Once decided that it was his turn to put the boy in his place. But he was wrong. The big man was covered in animal blood, and at that moment he was eating one of the legs. He turned towards the young man who had just dared to attack him. He couldn't stand being treated like that, so he decided to teach this jerk a lesson. With great strength, he swung his left hand, which was holding an underfed leg, at the thin boy and hit him right in the face. He was angry and dangerous. These words were confirmed by the fact that the big man did not stop at one blow to the face. As once it fell to the floor, his opponent continued to kick him with no remorse. Other boys took advantage of this fight and in turn ran to finish eating the pig. The woman who had recently saved Wansa from death watched this pitiful phenomenon from the sidelines. Finally, the fight died down. Another hard day for the boys was over. They lay directly on the ground, sending leaves under themselves, next to each other. Only Wansa separated from the general group and lay on both sides of everyone. In his dreams, he tried to find a better life than reality. He slept almost naked, wearing only his trousers, and resting his face on his right elbow. Suddenly some strange sounds woke the young man up. He opened his eyes and saw 2 loaves of bread in front of him. His face was bruised and disfigured from the fight with the big man. Vansa took one of the ktibs in his hands, feeling him by the touch. He was very grateful to the person who brought them to him and looked up to look at his savior. Above him stood a woman who saved him from a poisonous death. With pitiful eyes, the boy looked at the person who now saved him even from starvation. The woman ordered to be quiet. He tried to eat these breads as quietly as possible so as not to wake the rest. His face did not look good at all from the beatings he had received. The woman looked down on the young man, who was sitting and stuffing himself with dough at her feet. She was very sorry for the comatose boys, so she decided to feel sorry for him every once in a while. 20 years have passed, and Wonsu has hardly changed. He remained the same skinny guy, but now he could fight off anyone. He stood on the ground, feeling every drop of rain on his body. He remembered all those moments when he was in the cave, and the ignorant woman saved him more than once. He clenched his right fist, displacing all his anger and the world's injustice there. Wonsu decided to go further. He could not stand by these stones forever and think about the past. He needed to do something right now, if only to find a place to spend the night. He confidently stepped forward, relying on his abilities and luck. He was used to encountering constant obstacles in his life and injustice, so he was not afraid of anything. Suddenly he was stopped by his own feet. He sensed danger somewhere not far from him and decided that he needed to change his current plan of action a little. At that moment, Wonsu remembered the words of the woman he had never been able to save, that it was Huangbo who was trying to kill them, so from now on they were no longer welcome guests at Mage. Vaughn saw the face of a tortured woman begging him to go on with his life. The boy drew a conclusion from all these words. Vansa was chased by enemies in black masks. They constantly pursued him, focusing on the tracks. One of the warriors, looking at the ground, said that the trail ends here. He reported to his commander, the red-haired leader who sat on the throne. Hearing the words of his charge, he concluded that their enemy was confused. One of the warriors suggested that Wonsu would not return to Mage. The red-haired man was categorically not in agreement with his ward, because he had nowhere else to go except Mage. After sitting for a while and thinking about the words of his soldiers, the leader decided to look around. He saw a tree trunk broken almost to the root, which seemed strange to him. As soon as he saw this stump, he jumped off his throne with the speed of light. He was no longer going to sit in a comfortable place. The red-haired man came closer to the root of this tree to take a closer look at all the nuances. Having begun to look, the man noticed that this trunk was of some strange shape. There were incomprehensible patterns on its top, and snow lay all over its trunk. Having seen everything with his own eyes, the red-haired leader concluded that it was definitely him. The man had no doubts about this. He began scanning the area again, trying to find another clue. He succeeded. He noticed a piece of red cloth on the ground, which was brought by the wind. The man bent to the ground to pick up the scrap. He took it with his right hand, slowly lowering it and raising it up. After taking a closer look at this clue, a bright thought dawned on the man. A clear picture emerged in his head and he ordered his soldiers to go to the town. The wards responded positively. A bazaar was located right in the middle of the central square of a small town. Today it was very crowded here, and it is not surprising, because the weather was happy with sunshine and warmth. In the market, everyone sold what they wanted or what was unnecessary. Someone clumsily laid out the combs on the table, which glinted in the sun. These reflections caught the attention of a woman who approached the counter. She said she really liked the comb and asked how much it cost. And she was selling these combs that she clumsily displayed on her counter. With a satisfied face, she told the woman the price of the comb at 5 fun. The buyer began to express his dissatisfaction with the excessively high price. She said she would give a maximum of PHP 2 for a comb. Yeren did not want such a bargain and gently refused. But the woman insisted and said that she would either take 3 fun or leave. Yeren did not answer the woman. She needed to think a little. The woman knew her business. As soon as she left the counter, Yeren was already calling her back, agreeing to pay for 3. Having sold this comb to the woman, Yeren leaned over the wooden box and sighed with relief. She was pleased to have sold at least one of the combs. Suddenly, she heard some incomprehensible address in her direction. A male voice addressed her by name, and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Turning in the direction of the voice, the girl saw an aged man in front of her. He was short and smiling. He was escorted through the bazaar by a 2-man bodyguard behind him. The soldiers of one by quickly reached the town. The red-haired leader shifted on his throne as usual. As soon as the soldiers brought him closer to the girl, he immediately ordered to seize her. Yeren was completely shocked by what was happening. In addition, she was very frightened and screamed for help to the gentleman who approached her. The old man stopped the black-masked warriors by putting his hand forward. He ordered them not to move and asked if they even knew who he was, but this did not bother the soldiers at all. They had to obey their leader's orders and told the man to get out of the way if he didn't want to get hurt. He turned to face the girl behind him and asked what she had done to anger the warriors. Yeren replied that she did nothing at all. While the man and the girl were having their introductory conversation, one of the soldiers pounced on the old man and kicked him. The man could not do anything because he did not see the moment of the impact. At the same time, another warrior took advantage of his partner's surprise and finished off the old man with a fatal blow to the chest. The man screamed in pain, but could not do anything. Yeren stood in her place motionless and was shaking with fear. In front of her was a warrior who held a sword in his hand, from which blood slowly flowed. The woman couldn't figure out what she was doing here. When Yeren was about to say goodbye to her life, a stranger rushed to her aid. He shouted loudly for the soldiers to stand still and threw something in the face of one of them. It was a stone that hit the enemy's face well and then flew to the floor. Yeren was saved and hoped to get out of here as soon as possible. The red-haired man was not very happy with this turn of events. It was clear from his serious face that he did not see a serious threat in this, but it disturbed his plans. Yeren turned back to see her savior. It was a tall man in yellow clothes who held a sword behind his shoulders. He insulted the offenders and asked if they were not at all afraid of the law. Having come a little closer to Yeren, he turned to her as well, telling her to worry, because the man can take care of her and deal with the offenders. The stranger added that those who attack this person are really fearless people. He pointed to a man lying on the ground bleeding and introduced him as the man in charge of the area. The soldiers did not want to hear all this delusion from the man. They stood with their weapons in their hands, impatiently waiting for their leader to give the order to kill this prodigy. The man who stood up for the girl continued to be delusional. He turned his head in different directions, scratching it, and said how ill-mannered these boys were. In front of him was a whole group of armed soldiers, in the center of which circle sat a red-haired man on a throne. They were ready at any moment to rush to kill the enemy. Finally, the leader gave the order to attack the enemy, and 3 soldiers with weapons in their hands ran in his direction. The man stood still and waited for the enemies in his territory. The black-masked warriors tried to double strike to hit the chattering man, but he deftly dodged down and avoided a collision with the swords. Another warrior was waiting ahead of him, who was already attacking him. It was a planned combination to lull the enemy's vigilance. The warrior swung his sword right in front of the enemy's face, but everything was of no use to the man. He easily avoided this blow as well, rising up. The warriors raised their heads and realized where the target was now, but the target has now become a hunter. At this moment, in the air, the man in the yellow cloak decided that it was his turn to attack and swung his shining sword. He launched an attack with lightning speed and powerful force that sent enemies crashing to the ground. Some managed to block the blow, but it did not help to avoid a painful fall. The warriors fell right at the feet of their leader, who continued to sit on the throne. He was watching the action carefully, but he wasn't going to do anything just yet. The man in the yellow cloak stood in a victory pose. He said that once upon a time his opponents fell from his mighty sword. Yeren stood behind him, watching from the side just like the red-haired man. The warriors who had just been sent to the ground became very angry. They didn't want to tolerate being insulted by some rascal, because this was only the beginning of the fight. They were just about to teach him when the leader stopped them. He raised his right hand up. The man snapped his fingers, drawing attention to himself, and asked his wards to bring him his whip immediately. 2 of the wards barely dragged that whip along the ground. Its metal and heaviest part dragged on the ground and appeared at first glance too heavy to be a useful weapon in battle. As always, the red-haired man had a different opinion. As soon as the whip was brought closer to him, he grabbed its soft part with his right hand, firmly grasping the entire width of the rope. He looked very dangerous with such a whip in his hands. The iron part of the weapon was on the ground, and the man himself was firmly holding the rope, staring fiercely ahead of him. The man in the yellow cloak continued the conversation with a smile. He asked the red-haired man if he was the boss here. He made such a conclusion, because the warrior looked much more solid than the rest. The red-haired leader also smiled, but his smile was not friendly or witty at all. He was going to destroy his imager, and said that he was too insolent and talked a lot. The leader threw a mighty blow with his whip, which the yellow-cloaked man was able to block with his sword, placing the weapon in front of his face. The metal end of the whip that the red-haired man used to attack the enemy was not entirely simple. At its end, the muzzle of a snake with sharp teeth was clearly visible. The man was not completely shocked by such an attack. He stared at the crack of his weapon and wondered what kind of attack it was and why he had entered the fight first. Opposite stood the figure of a red-haired evil warrior with furrowed eyebrows. He looked very demonic and was not going to negotiate with his enemy. It turned out that the opponent did not completely break the brave boy's sword. He rejected one of his parts and invited the enemy to engage in a real battle. The red-haired man opposite was very angry. He shouted loudly that his opponent was a real fool and did not understand what he was getting himself into. In the same small town, Vansa decided to stop for a short time. He was sitting in one of the haunts, where there were wooden tables and benches outside. Wansu was in despair at what had happened to him recently. He poured himself a beer and was going to distract himself from everything. Suddenly he heard someone's voice behind him. Behind him stood two men, wondering why it was so noisy. One of them assumed that a market had opened there, but the other said that there was no need to go there, as there was a fight there. The man was surprised by this of his interlocutor, and asked again. He confirmed his words about the fight, and said that Ho Deheb contacted some unknown foreigners. Wansu heard the entire dialogue between these men. He listened intently to every word as he sipped his drink from the glass. The men decided to go watch the fight. They wondered what made Deheb so angry. The battle in the central market was in full swing. The red-haired man threw his whip in the attack. Its tip in the form of a snake rushed forward to kill the enemy. The man who resisted the bandits stood firmly on his feet and was not going to give up. With a few skillful swings of his sword, he deflected 3 powerful whip blows from his opponent. The red-haired leader was amazed by such a reaction and speed of the enemy, but it was not the first such thing on his way. Taking the whip even tighter, the man saw a good moment for himself. He noticed a gap in the enemy's defense on the right. The attack of his whip had to go directly to the right side of the enemy, but it was possible to avoid a blow with a quick movement to the other side and the blade of the sword. But it was not the end. The red-haired man anticipated the enemy's resistance with the sword. He deftly pulled the rope of his whip, and it began to go around the blade of the sword. The man in the yellow cloak certainly did not expect such a turn of events. The opponent's weapon imperceptibly for him avoided the block of his sword, and the iron snake stuck right into his skin. The man fell to his right knee, holding his injured side. The wound was quite deep and blood flowed out in large quantities. The man concluded that if he continued to simply defend himself, he might lose this fight. It took him literally a couple of seconds to prepare for the attack. Then he rushed into battle, closing in on his opponent. He yelled at him for the redhead to prepare for his attack. The red-haired man was as focused on the enemy as possible. He ignored his empty chatter and carefully watched his further movements. As the opponent approached him, the man constantly maneuvered his whip with a snake on the end to catch the enemy in the act at some point. The blood of the man in the yellow cloak was spilled again on the battlefield. He should have been more careful, but he ignored the circumstances. At the last moment he managed to block the blow with the whip. The iron snake that was at the very end of the weapon ended up right in his right hand, piercing her palm. The man understood that only in this way he could immobilize the enemy, and he would not be able to use his weapon. A man in a yellow cloak held a sword in his left hand, with which he was going to finish off his opponent. The red-haired leader was impressed by the boy's courage and his fighting skills. He saw his sword directly above his head and wondered what he should do in this situation. His opponent was definitely more concerned about the man who was in danger. He understood that this might be his only chance to end the enemy once and for all. The fears of the man in the yellow cloak came true. His opponent threw the whip to the ground and parried the blow of his sword by grabbing it with both hands. The red-haired leader firmly blocked the enemy's blow. He held the blade of his sword as hard as he could with both hands, on which the veins stood out and the blood came out. He broke off a large part of the sword that he now held in his hands. The man said that this attempt was not bad enough, and that this had never happened to him before. He twirled the severed blade of his sword in his bleeding right hand and was about to charge at the enemy as they stood in complete shock. The red-haired man said that for such a good attempt, he would reward his opponent and leave him one hand. After these words, he swung his blade at the enemy and cut off his hand. A river of blood flowed from the man's limb. He looked at his hand with horror and screamed loudly, but nothing could be done. People who had come to watch the fight in the central market stood in utter horror, covering their eyes. They didn't get to see this every day. Among these people was Wonsu, who successfully hid his persona under a black cloak. He watched all this action with a stone face. The red-haired leader walked closer to the man whose arm he had just cut off and took him by the throat. He lifted it a couple of centimeters off the ground and said that it would go down to feed the dogs. After that, the man simply threw his opponent to the ground. The armless boy flew to the floor and drove along it for a couple of meters. The wards of the red-haired leader came to look at his severed hand. She looked at the wound as if it were an exhibit in a museum. Wonsu at this time was sitting on a tree above the heads of his enemies. Suddenly, this picture in life caused him terrible emotions. He looked at the black-masked warriors with wide eyes and hated them. Wonsu remembered the moment when the same warriors in black suits stood over the person who was dear to him. An arrow was sticking out of her body, and blood was constantly flowing from her chest. There was dead silence in the market now. But someone decided to break it by taking a step back. It was a girl in a red dress who wanted to run away from the scene. One of the soldiers noticed this movement and became alert. He turned his head in the direction of the sounds he had just heard to see everything with his own eyes. Right in front of him he saw the girl who had been their target from the beginning. Yeren realized that the two men who could protect her were no longer able to do so, so she needed to run away as soon as possible. After the massacre, the territory of the market was empty and quiet. The thick snow was sweeping between the rows, which now there was no one to trample. Yeren ran away from her attackers along one of these lines. She still could not understand what they needed from her and just ran forward, trying to break away. She looked back for a second to see how far the robbers were from her. They almost did not catch up with the girl, and this worried her very much. The girl did not even have time to turn her head forward again, as the warriors in black masks had already caught up with her and were rushing ahead of her, moving along the wall. Two of them landed right in front of Yeren. Their assignment was to stop the girl as soon as possible and find out from her all the information they needed. One of the soldiers did not wait long and took the girl by the neck with his left hand. He pressed her against the wall, and Yeren screamed from the pain in her throat and back. The warrior in the black mask took out a knife from his pocket and began to threaten the girl in the red dress. And he put the gun to her throat and asked where the same guy was. Yeren at that moment could not figure out what the man in front of her was talking about. She was very scared and asked what it was all about. At this moment, the other warriors had already managed to bring their leader to the throne. The red-haired man explained to the girl that he was talking about the man with whom she was in the forest. In Yeren's imagination, the figure of a mysterious stranger who saved her from robbers appeared. She could not believe that she was being asked about this boy. Standing in front of the red-headed leader's throne, Yeren said she knew nothing about this mysterious stranger. She added that she saw him for the first time in this forest. The leader did not believe the frightened girl. He, with a mischievous smile on his face, asked her if she even understood the seriousness of this situation. One of the soldiers understood his leader's order without words. He grabbed the girl's right hand and lowered her to the ground, holding her tightly. Yeren loudly asked her to let her go, and did not understand what was being done to her. The warrior standing over her drew his sword from behind his back. He said it was to help her remember everything as quickly and painlessly as possible. He swung his sword and was about to cut off the girl's hand. Yeren really wanted to save her limb, but she really didn't know anything about that man from the forest. After a couple of seconds, nothing happened. It seemed very strange to Yeren, and she decided to finally open her eyes. Her face was flushed with fear. The girl saw in front of her the same man who saved her in the forest. He came to her aid even now, grabbing the enemy's sword and preventing him from cutting off the girl's hand. Once his face looked very demonic at that moment. He held the blade of the sword with his right hand, and with his gaze burned out the enemy's eyes. The black-masked warrior wasn't going to play tag with his enemy for long. Wresting the sword from Once's hands, he struck with all his might, which was about to cut the man's throat. But Vans, as always, had other plans for this. He deftly intercepted the sword from his opponent, and redirected it directly into the opponent's neck. The enemy fell powerlessly to the ground, covered in blood. He sighed heavily from the excruciating pain, while the others stood and watched. Yeren was generally shocked, although it was not the first time she had seen such a thing. Once stood still in his place and looked ahead. Behind him was a girl in a red dress whom he had saved in the forest, and now he could not refuse her help either. A red-haired man was looking at them both. He was smiling mischievously. His face was shining with pleasure. He said he finally found the one he was looking for. Then followed the order to kill the man opposite. The warriors in black masks quickly followed the leader's order. Each of them rushed into battle with weapons in hand at a lone man who was standing a couple of meters away from them all. Wonsu was not alone. Behind him was Yeren, whose life he also had to worry about. A large number of enemies were closing in on him, and needed to be calmed down. The first to enter the battle were two warriors who tried to decapitate Vans with a double blow with their swords. But the man dodged the attack, stepping back and taking the girl with him. After successfully dodging the attack, Wonsu decided it was his time to attack. He struck with all his might with his right fist straight at the enemy. He flew back, but was followed by another sword blow. Vans managed to avoid this collision with the sword as well, covering the girl behind with his body. He grabbed his offender by the throat. The enemy's eyes were wide open and frightened, because he knew that death was unlikely to escape. Wonsu pushed the enemy's body into the ground with all his might with a loud sound. He put enough force into this strike to paralyze the enemy's body. The face of the warrior in the black mask looked terrible. Blood ran from his whole body, and at the last moment he regretted that he had attacked this man at all. The other warriors stood aside and guarded their red-haired leader with weapons in hand. They were all shocked by what they saw in front of them. They did not really want to engage in battle with such a strong enemy. The red-haired man sat on his throne and smiled demonically. He said that, as he expected, this young man is not so simple and it will be difficult with him. He took a couple of seconds to consider his next course of action. Then the leader gave the order to surround the enemy and apply a group block on him. In one voice, the soldiers shouted that they were obeying their master. After a couple of seconds, almost all the warriors were standing in one circle, in the center of which was Wonsu. Behind him was Yeren, who was trembling with fear. As soon as the enemies began to advance, Wonsu pushed the girl away from him so as not to expose her to the attack. He was going to deal with everyone on his own. He was attacked by 3 opponents at once in the first second. But the man was ready for this and deftly avoided the attack by jumping up. Wonsu rose into the air while his enemies stood on the ground and stared at him. They realized that they needed to act even faster to hit the enemy, while the man was still in the air, for warriors in black masks decided to catch him in the atmospheric environment. They rose to the level of the enemy's head and were going to cut him to pieces. Another danger awaited Wonsu on Earth. His enemies thought everything through, and one of them positioned himself right under the man's feet to meet him at the moment of landing. The man needed to assess the situation as quickly as possible to save his life. He decided to rest his left hand directly on the face of the warrior below. In this way, Vaughn managed to avoid a group attack by his enemies and save himself from death with the help of another person's head. The man decided to finish off the warrior, on whose head Vaughn leaned to save himself, in an instant. He grabbed his face and slammed it into the ground. The same group of warriors was approaching Wonsu. The man sat on top of the body of the defeated opponent and waited for the moment to counterattack in time. He decided that the moment had come and took out a sword from behind the defeated enemy. But as soon as the ball got into Wonsu's hands, it immediately cracked. The man threw aside the broken sword, which cracked into 2 parts, and decided to do without a weapon for the time being. He had no other way out, and he waited for his enemies to do so, standing still. Suddenly, Wonsu noticed a glint on the ground and bent down. He had little time, so he did it as quickly as possible. On the ground lay a dagger that one of the warriors had dropped during the previous skirmish. This was now the main trump card up Wonsu's sleeve against his opponents. Warriors in black masks ran forward at the unarmed enemy, hoping that he would not cause them any harm. But Wonsu couldn't just stand there and fight back. He made a lightning attack on 3 bodies of enemies, cutting them. One of the soldiers decided to take revenge for his comrades and rushed to attack the enemy. He swung his sword, trying to hit the opponent, but the latter dodged. After avoiding a sword strike, Wonsu launched his counterattack at the enemy. With all his might, the man put his left foot on the enemy's face and smeared it properly. Wonsu did not have time to deal with the previous enemy, as the next attack followed him. One of the warriors threw his sword at the man and shouted that he must die. Perhaps it was the expected cry of the enemy that saved Wonsu from death. At the last moment, he managed to avoid the flight of the sword, which flew directly over his head. Enemies attacked Wonsu one by one. Then a warrior, whom Wonsu had already defeated, rose from the ground. On his face, the Koma mask was torn, through which one could see the warrior's emotions. He gripped the enemy with both hands and shouted loudly. But Wonsu wasn't going to wait for someone to catch up with him in this pace. He freed his left hand and used it to break his opponent's finger. The latter shouted loudly again. After such a surprise, Wonsu also struck the warrior behind him in the face. The enemy was completely shocked by such a turn of events, and had no choice but to take the blow. The attacks of the enemies did not stop. No sooner had Wonsu defeated one enemy than another attacked him. The next one just ran at him and screamed, clenching his fist. This opponent did not cause Vons any problems. The man easily pushed him away with his shoulder, insulting the enemy right in the chest. Another danger lurked behind this diversionary maneuver. The two warriors charged at Wonsu, preparing to deliver a double blow that would take the enemy's head off. But Wonsu did not think of losing to these losers. He expertly fell to the floor and, twisting a couple of times around his axis, avoided a double threat from his opponents. Of course, the man was not going to stop there and lie on the floor. He quickly rose to his feet and pushed himself off the ground with one of them. Wonsu's opponents were confused and shocked at how clever their enemy was. They had just managed to get back to him, and he was already attacking them. One of the soldiers again tried to finish off the enemy with a precise sword blow to the head. He swung his weapon with more force and shouted for the man to finally die. He could have said these glory to anyone else, but not to Vons. He was a difficult opponent, and it was impossible to defeat him with such an attack. He delivered a powerful blow with his right palm to the opponent's chin. The warrior fell to the floor from the collision with the enemy's hand and pulled his legs up. The rest of the warriors stood behind their comrades and watched the action, preparing their attacks. But their leader had other plans. He sat motionless on his throne and watched the futile attacks of his wards. At this point he ordered them to stop. He got up from his warm seat to join the fight himself. In his hands, of course, he held his deadly weapon, a whip with an iron tip. The red-haired man said as soon as he got back on his 2 feet that he had specially trained the warriors to catch this protovist, but they proved to be inept in battle. The soldiers paid for their unprofessionalism. Their leader raised his whip in the air and lashed it hard at the necks of his charges. Wonsu stood opposite and watched as the leader mocked the other warriors. He understood that the red-haired man would be his next opponent. The leader whipped his wards with his whip. The bloody blood of innocent soldiers flowed down its iron end. But their husbands' problems and life did not bother him at all. Wonsu and the red-headed leader stood facing each other, looking into each other's eyes. The warrior with the whip turned to his opponent and said that they were finally left alone. He stood in his place, grinning mischievously and provoking the enemy. At one point, he raised his right hand up and waved it in his direction, offering to attack his first opponent. Wonsu never doubted his strength. In addition, the man made him very angry, and he could no longer stand still. Wonsu began to attack his enemy, moving quickly towards him and clenching his right fist. Wonsu rushed towards the enemy with all his might. The red-haired man waited for his prey, standing still and preparing to attack. As soon as he saw that the enemy had approached the distance he needed, the man raised his whip from the ground and struck it in the direction of the enemy. The iron part of the whip was about to hit Wonsu, but he skillfully avoided the collision with the metal snake. Hitting him was not so easy, and the enemy understood that. Wonsu was almost close to the enemy. He was about to punch him hard in the chest. The collision was a couple of centimeters away. The red-haired man sensed danger approaching him at the speed of light. He tightened his grip on his whip and swung it with more strength in the direction opposite to the blow. Thus, he changed the attack direction of his whip. The snake was now moving towards Wonsu, coming from behind him. but the man noticed the danger behind him in time. He twisted as fast as he could in the air to let the attack pass him. As it turned out, the snake, which was splashed with blood, failed to take another victim. The red-haired man praised his opponent for such actions, saying that he was really agile. But then he wanted to see how the enemy would cope with the next attack in his direction. He twisted his whip as hard as he could, making a very long and dangerous spiral. If you touched even a part of the whip, you could get trapped or cut yourself. Wonsu understood this perfectly, and avoided every whip movement that his opponent used. He skillfully moved literally inside the spiral. Having avoided direct danger, Wonsu continued his movement in the direction of the enemy. But another danger awaited him behind. The opponent twisted his whip again and directed the iron part of it at Wonsu. The red-haired warrior noticed that his opponent was not looking back at all and thought that he had escaped all danger. Continuing to twist his whip, he called the opponent a fool, but Wonsu saw everything perfectly. He studied the combat movements of his enemy in detail, and knew exactly what would happen at the next moment. The man deftly rose into the air, avoiding a direct hit. He was focused on every detail on the battlefield. The man with red hair was in shock. A second ago, he was sure that his opponent would not be able to avoid his attack, but now everything turned out to be different. The metal end of his whip stuck straight into the ground, causing no harm to the legal boy. All the iron snake had for dinner were rocks. In an instant, Wonsu found himself over the head of his enemy. He lifted his right leg up, preparing a blow that would hit the enemy head-on. The red-haired warrior, in an instant, threw his weapon out of his hand. He sensed danger from above, so he decided that the best solution would be to leave his whip. Wonsu threw his kick with all his might, which was supposed to go straight to the opponent's head. But the latter managed to block the attack by bringing both hands together. The red-haired warrior held the blow as hard as he could. He could feel how strong Wonsu was and how much power he put into each punch. The red-haired man decided not to hold such loads any longer, and made every effort to throw the enemy off his head. In turn, he prepared his own attack, putting all his energy into his left hand, which approached the enemy's face and was about to finish him off. But at the last moment Wonsu noticed the blow and predicted the consequences. So he immediately got out of the situation by jumping to the side to avoid fatal damage. He managed to avoid the enemy's attack, but the latter was preparing another one. The red-headed warrior clenched his left fist, which was to finish off the thin boy. Wonsu raised his hands up to take the blow on his arms. He decided that in such a situation, this would be the best solution. The man was very surprised when the enemy's attack missed his body by literally a couple of millimeters. He still held his hands up. Wonsu then delivered a blow of terrible force to the enemy's arm, which was near the man's chest. He was not going to defend himself anymore and decided to attack. Having delivered his first blow, the man did not resist, because he understood that he would not win with this. Wonsu soared into the air, spinning and preparing for his next attack. Spinning as hard as he could in the air, the man struck his enemy with his right leg, knocking him back. The attack was extremely powerful, so the enemy could not stand still. The red-haired warrior flew back, clinging to the ground with his hands and feet to stand. He realized that he had slightly underestimated his opponent, and now took the fight more responsibly. The warrior landed right next to his weapon. Without thinking long, he picked up his whip from the ground and took it more firmly in his right hand. He wasn't going to wait for the best man until his opponent attacked first. The red-haired leader rushed to attack first, striking with a whip. The attack was too slow for Wonsu, so he easily dodged it. The blow hit the wall of one of the buildings standing on the market square. However, the target of the red-haired warrior's attack was not a man at all. He purposely punched the wall so that when he pulled out the whip from there, large stone blocks would knock Wonsu down. The leader did so. Stone blocks fell to the ground, releasing a lot of dust from under them. Big clouds formed behind which nothing could be seen. Yeren stood aside and watched all this. Seeing that Vons was in mortal danger in the form of stones, the girl was very alarmed and screamed. But Wonsu was not one of those who die so easily. His figure began to emerge from all this pile of dust. His face was as focused as possible on the fight. The man remembered a moment from his teenage life. He trained in that forgotten cave, where real hard labor always awaited him. The boy screamed loudly from pain and misunderstanding. Above him, on top of the rocks, stood 3 teachers who were watching him. The boy had a state of Juvadma. He could not control his energy in his body for mental reasons. A woman from above said that training was about to begin. Once lifted his head up while standing on his knees and saw a snake's tail in front of him. At first, the boy did not understand what was going to happen here. Suddenly, fear began to appear in his eyes. Drops of sweat from his face began to slowly flow down, showing his true emotions. Carefully opening his eyes, Once saw in front of him a huge blue snake with a red belly. She looked very scary, sticking out her tongue and teeth. A woman standing on top of a rock added fuel to the fire. She said that one bite from this snake can kill a healthy bull. Once stood on his straight legs and looked directly into the snake's creepy eyes. He practically did not have the strength to fight her best man, but he had no choice. The boy got into a fighting stance in front of the snake. He was going to use a technique called Ghost Devil Blood Punch. The young man still had fear on his face and drops of fruit were running down his face. But he tried to overcome everything, clenching his right fist tighter. He looked directly into the eyes of the snake, which was also ready for the fact that they wanted to cause it harm. Onsen knew that the best technique to defeat an enemy was to use his own weapons against him. The young man approached the snake with the speed of light. With an accurate and strong blow, he hit the animal right in the neck, as a result of which the head of the snake separated from the body. Above the boy stood teachers who were satisfied with such a result. One of them said that the boy had finally learned his lesson. Once had learned this lesson really well then and was going to use the opponent's technique now. He got into a fighting stance, showing his readiness to attack. The red-haired leader, seeing what the man was doing, was very surprised. He still did not understand anything about the movements that his opponent was making. He wasn't going to wait for his enemy to attack, so he attacked first. The red-haired warrior screamed and moved in the direction of the enemy, holding a whip in his right hand. Getting a little closer to Wonsu, the man made a powerful blow with his whip, which was supposed to hit the opponent's head. He hated the person standing in front of him, so he put as much effort into each blow as possible. Wonsu, on the other hand, was restrained and concentrated. He was taught from childhood not to give in to emotions and to think with a cold mind. He deftly dodged an attack to the head. As soon as the man dodged a blow, he rushed to attack himself. We moved low like a bird to keep the effective surprise for his enemy. The red-haired warrior noticed the enemy in time, who was moving towards him parallel to the ground. He decided that it needed to be stopped immediately, and took appropriate measures. But even this attack with a whip along the ground did not bring any result. Wonsu deftly dodged the blow, jumping up in time. Wonsu confidently and quickly approached his enemy, dodging powerful enemy attacks along the way. He jumped up again, but this time he was already preparing his attack. The red-haired warrior constantly swung his whip, trying to stop the enemy. At one point he noticed that his enemy was about to attack from above, and shouted at the top of his lungs for him to attack. Wonsu was not stopped by the enemy's counterattacks or his inappropriate words. The man was focused on winning and getting out of this difficult duel alive. The red-haired warrior noticed that an enemy hand was coming towards him, which could strike him. He was surprised that his enemy was attacking directly in the forehead, which was not very characteristic of Vaughn's. Noticing the opponent's prepared blow in time, the red-haired man managed to throw a blow with his whip to stop the opponent. The metal snake was a couple of centimeters away from striking the opponent, but Vaughn's expertly managed to avoid the blow by twisting in the air. He expected this from his enemy, so he knew in advance what he would do in such a situation. Now nothing stood in the way of the young warrior. He quickly used his advantage in position and speed, and with all his might delivered a powerful blow with his right hand directly into the opponent's chest. The red-haired man was in complete shock. He did not expect that the enemy would be able to approach him so quickly, and there was nothing he could do. Blood flew from his mouth from the enemy's attack. Wonsu understood that he would not be able to defeat such a strong opponent with one blow. Therefore, he did not limit himself to one attack and continued to deliver blows from which the enemy managed to evade. The red-haired warrior realized that the whip only aggravated him in this situation, so he threw it on the ground. Instead, he pulled a short, sharp knife from his bosom. To stop the enemy and avoid death, the leader tried to hit the enemy with his dagger. He cut the air in front of him with it to prevent the enemy from getting closer. Once noticed the change of weapon by the enemy in time and stopped a little. He gave his enemy a chance to get a little angry with him and wave his daggers in the air, of which there were already two. The man dodged the attack slightly downwards. But the red-haired warrior noticed the enemy's maneuver and directed the knife directly in his direction. It seemed that this blow would be inevitable, but Vons had completely different plans and views. He quickly grabbed the enemy's arm, stopping his attack, and with his other hand pierced the enemy's chin. His fingers came right out of the red-headed warrior's mouth. Then, with all his might, the man removed his fingers from the enemy's temple, tearing the enemy's mouth open. From such a strong pain, the red-haired warrior shouted to the whole valley. Now that was all he could do in this situation. He fell powerlessly to the ground, hitting his face directly on the stones. The red-haired warrior could no longer resist the enemy and looked helpless. His face began to swim with blood, which was pouring from his chin. The man's eyes turned red and immediately began to close. The life left his body little by little. In the end, the red-haired leader died in agony, lying on the ground and bleeding. Now his face showed no emotion, only emptiness in his eyes. Once stood above the defeated enemy and watched him suffer. The man didn't feel sorry at all for doing this to his enemies, but it wasn't his fault at all. The sky above the old house that stood under the mountain was already beginning to darken. Evening was gathering outside, bringing the sun with it over the horizon. The old man lay in his bed and sighed heavily. Above him sat his daughter, who had just returned and asked if everything was okay with her dad. The man did not understand anything at first. He climbed up and only then saw that his daughter was sitting next to him. He replied that he was feeling well and asked when Yeren returned. The girl replied that she had just entered the house. The father assumed that his daughter was very tired and offered her at least a little rest. Yeren was very worried. She was not worried about her father's words at all, but was thinking about something else, lowering her head. The father noticed that his daughter was not behaving very naturally, and was hiding her eyes. He asked her if she sometimes wanted to tell him something else. An even bigger woman began to worry, going through the hair on her head. She replied that she wanted to say something, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Now the husband began to worry together with his daughter. He looked at her cautiously, and asked what had happened. Yeren decided not to answer her dad. She thought that it was better to see everything than to hear it 100 times. The girl simply opened the window in the house to show everything. Just in front of the window stood Wonsu in his tattered cloak. He looked very serious, and did not care at all about the looks of strangers. Looking at the young man outside the window, the old man did not understand anything. He asked his daughter who it was. Yeren could not answer her father's question from the very beginning. The owners let the man into the house and fed him. Wonsu ate as if he hadn't seen food in months. The owners of the house were in complete shock and were surprised by the boy's wild appetite. While Wonsu sat at the small table and stuffed his cheeks, Yeren and father simply watched this action from the side, not interfering with the man's filling of his stomach. Wonsu finally finished his meal. He put the bowl on the table, from which he ate everything to a crumb, and as if he exhaled with relief. Yeren came up to him in a moment, stood next to him and started to smile. She took the bowl from his hands and offered the man another portion. Wonsu felt awkward at this moment. Drops of sweat began to flow from his face. He did not know how to behave in such a situation and simply nodded, agreeing with the girl. While Yeren went to pour another portion of Vons, her father addressed him. He told the boy that he had a very good appetite. The old man added that of course this fee was not enough for his daughter's savior, but unfortunately it was all they could offer him. The father thanked the man for accepting this meal as a reward. While the old man was finishing his speech, Yeren had already managed to pour another bowl of soup and brought it to Wonsu. He, in turn, sat motionless at a small table. Yeren looked at the tattered warrior's cloak and concluded that he had nowhere to spend the night. She politely offered her savior to stay with them for a couple of days. Wonsu was about to start the next bowl of food again. He looked at the spoon in his hands and did not know if he was doing the right thing. When the man put the spoon in his mouth, Yeren patted him on the back. She told the man not to think that he might cause them any inconvenience by his presence. It was completely dark outside. The green trees, which had looked charming in the daytime, now took on an eerie black appearance under the moonlight. Nothing was lit in the house. The old man was sleeping in his usual place, covered with a blanket. Opposite him, there was a bed for Wonsu, who was used to sleeping in the cold, so he took off the blanket. Yeren's father woke up in the middle of the night. His thoughts about the man who saved his daughter did not leave him. He looked in his direction and noticed only the exposed back of the boy. The old man got up from his bed and began to move in the direction of the sleeping Vons. He looked serious and focused, as if he was about to do something. The warrior heard some strange sounds around him and immediately woke up. He opened his eyes to make sure he was safe. At this moment, the old man was already approaching Wonsu's sleeping place. The man could hear his footsteps slowly moving towards him. The young man tensed and was worried by such movements of the old man. He clenched his right hand into a fist and was ready for anything at that moment. Yeren's father walked up to Vons and took his blanket in his hands. He slowly covered the boy from above, so as not to wake him up, and said that you can catch a cold that way. After that, the old man went to sleep again with a calm soul. Wonsu was shocked by what happened. He expected anything, but not that he would simply be approached and covered with a blanket. The morning has come. The owners of the house have not slept since dawn, as things wait for no one. Yeren left the house with a bag on her shoulders and told her father that she would be back soon. She noticed a lone man sitting on a tree branch above her. She greeted him, waving his hand, and asked how he slept in his new place. Wonsu was not used to having a constructive dialogue with people, so he simply turned his face away. He did not want to tell anything, as he had always done so before. The girl was not offended at all by her husband. She kept smiling and trying to start a dialogue. Yeren offered her husband to keep her company if he had nothing else to do. Wonsu sat motionless in his seat, staring somewhere into the void. Yeren concluded that the young man did not want to go with her and broke away from her husband. When the girl was about to leave, Wonsu suddenly spoke to her. Turning to face the woman, the man said that it would not be convenient for him somehow. Looking at all the troubles and misunderstandings between themselves, they went to the market. Life was the key here. People talked to each other as usual and tried to sell something to each other. Yeren was no exception. She stood at her stall selling jewelry to people. In front of her stood two people who were going to buy something from her. The woman tried on the jewelry that Yeren offered her to try on. She flaunted herself in front of her husband and asked him what he thought about it. It was a hair comb. The woman gave it to her husband so that he could take a closer look. The man stood for a long time and looked at the object in his right hand. Then he just threw it on the ground. The comb fell to the floor and bounced off it without breaking, but the man did not like him at all. He stepped on it with all his might, breaking the ornament. Yeren tried to stop him, but she did not succeed. The man was angry. He yelled at Yeren, who was on her knees trying to gather the jewelry into a pile. How dare she offer this cheap thing to his future wife? Yeren was also not going to be silent, and shouted back at her husband. She said that if he didn't like it, he could just not buy it, instead of breaking it on the spot. The man dropped a couple of gold coins on the ground as he left the counter. He said that this would be enough to buy all of Yeren's trinkets combined. The woman was still on her knees collecting coins. She was very angry with the couple, despite the fact that they had left her some money. Rising to her feet, the woman was overcome with even greater anger. She could barely hold herself in her arms so as not to shout obscene words after this man. Wonsu caught up with this prodigal and took him by the throat. He raised him above ground level and asked him what he was doing. The woman asked Wonsu who he was, why he was behaving like that. The boy didn't care what was said and thought about him at that moment. He was angry at the person who had just offended the girl who had welcomed him into her home. While Wonsu held the offender by the throat in the air, the latter still found the strength to say something. He called Wonsu a bum and asked him if he was with that girl. With these words, the man angered Wonsu even more. He didn't like it when they said too much and squeezed the man's throat even harder. At that moment, someone approached Wonsu from the side and tapped him on the shoulder. The young man did not understand who dared to approach him at such a moment. Turning his head to the side, Wonsu saw Yeren in front of him, who was trying to calm him down. She asked him not to do this and to stop immediately. Wansu listened to the woman's words and released the man he was holding by the throat. He fell to the ground, hitting his back hard. The man and his future wife rushed to run away from Wansu. While running away, the man called Wansu a scumbag and said that he would regret his concession. After finishing the day's work at the market, Yeren returned home with Wansu. The woman walked through the forest ahead, and the boy followed her. Walking forward, the girl constantly turned towards her husband in displeasure, and wanted to express a claim to him. At last she dared to speak to Vance. With displeasure on her face, the girl asked Wansu if he always solves his problems this way. She began to step in his direction and shout loudly that he only does what he does, that every day he gets into some kind of fight. Wansu even got scared, retreating back. Having approached her husband in the shelter, Yeren added that if he continues to do this, she will no longer be able to live with them. Wansu felt uncomfortable in such a conflicted environment. The girl continued her lecture and said that this way, people will hate Wansu for his actions. The man listened to his interlocutor in silence. Yeren looked at the boy at that moment, who was just blinking his eyes, and realized that nothing would happen to him. She said he could do whatever he wanted, she didn't care. Having finished voicing her displeasure towards her husband, Yeren headed home again. On the way, she continued to be angry with the boy, but at some point, she felt sorry for Vance, because he was not like everyone else and could simply not understand her words to the end. She turned her head in his direction and looked at the lone figure of a young man standing in the middle of the path in the forest with his head down. She decided to teach him a lesson with her own words and began to approach him again, and call him a fool. Approaching Wansu again in the shelter, Yeren looked into his eyes and decided to take a promise from him. Her condition was that the man would never fight again. Wansu bent his head down so as not to look into the girl's eyes. He understood that he could not make such a promise yet, because he did not know when the next time something would happen to him. But Yeren insisted and put pressure on the boy. She looked him in the eyes again and asked if he understood her. Wansu nodded silently, agreeing with the interlocutor. Suddenly, the girl realized that she did not even know the name of her current roommate. She looked at him and asked the man's name. Wansu didn't want to say his name right away. He very well understood the value of every word, because danger could await him from any side. Not hearing an answer, Yeren asked if the boy really didn't have a name. She was embarrassed, because she needed to address him somehow. The man raised his head proudly and said his name was Wansu. He still dared to tell his real name to a stranger who sheltered him for a short time. The girl was very surprised by such a name. She had never heard him before, and told the boy that even his name sounded creepy. Having completed all the affairs, Yeren's family went to rest, and Wansu along with them. That night, the man had already covered himself with a blanket so as not to stress the old man over trifles one more time. People slept peacefully in their homes, unaware that danger awaited them from the outside. Some thugs with weapons in their hands were standing in front of the house and waiting. In front of them was their leader in a green robe, assessing the situation. They definitely wanted to break into Yeren's house unexpectedly and catch Wansu by surprise. The leader of thugs looked at the house where Yeren's family spent the night and made a decision. It was the same man who had offended Wansu. At one point, he gave an order to kill everyone. His hired wards agreed to carry out the order. They started towards the house, each holding a bat in his hand. One of the robbers, approaching the house, shouted loudly. He demanded that the people inside immediately go outside. Without waiting for an answer, the man noticed something strange behind him. He decided to return to make sure of what he did not think. That's how it turned out. Wansu was already standing behind the bandits, grabbing two of them by their weapons. The thugs were simply shocked by such an unexpected appearance of the boy. The man whom Wansu had insulted in the market pointed his finger at him and told him to kill him immediately. He was very angry and confident in his abilities. The thugs rushed to carry out the order of their boss. But their plans were destroyed in an instant by Wansu's hands. With one precise movement, he took away their weapons and smashed them against their heads. The third robber approached from behind, hoping that the enemy did not see him. But he was very wrong. Wansu easily avoided the enemy's primitive attack. Then, with one precise blow, the man knocked his enemy off his feet. He did everything so quickly that his opponents did not even have time to understand that they attacked the wrong person. When the robber fell to the ground, Once kicked him in the back with all his might. The enemy screamed loudly in pain, and his blood spilled out on the battlefield. Once lifted his head up to look at the man who had started it all. His eyes said that he would spare no one today. A man in a green robe stood opposite and saw everything. He was looking at Once's leg, which had just finished off one of his mercenaries and was bleeding. The man called the boy crazy. After these words, the man instantly lost his balance. Something caused him to tear his feet off the ground and fly to the floor. It was a swift kick to Once that sent his foe to the ground. While he was polishing the stones with his back, Once slowly approached him. Seeing the creepy figure of the boy in front of him, the man was very scared. He imagined what was waiting for him, and called out loudly for help to at least someone. Once took him by the throat with his right hand and swung his left hand at his face, pointing his fingers forward. The man admitted that he was wrong and offered to pay handsomely if the villain would leave him alive. A second later, the coins fell to the ground. The man did not have much time to persuade the enemy not to hurt him, and he used it to the maximum. At that moment, Once remembered Yeren, who was angry with this man. He, just like now, threw a couple of coins to the girl, which she trampled on the jewelry. Once became even more angry at Yeren's abuser. His face became terribly creepy and he was definitely not going to spare his opponent. Once directed his left hand straight into the enemy's face. He poked his fingers into his eyes, from which blood poured out. The man screamed loudly from the terrible pain. Yeren quickly rushed to these cries. Approaching Once's figure, the girl was in complete shock. She also screamed as she saw the gruesome scene of murder before her face. Yeren looked around and saw the bodies of dead people covered in blood. Of course, she understood that this was all the work of Onsu, and asked him how he could act so heartlessly. Onsu raised his head as he looked at Yeren's face. He calmed down a bit, and just realized what he had done. The woman stood still, clenching her fists. She was very angry with the man who promised her earlier not to do that again. Yeren screamed in fury at Wansa and said that if he was going to keep doing all this, he might as well run out of their house. Having told her husband everything she was going to, the girl went to her house, loudly closing the front door. Wansa looked after her with a sad face. He rose to his feet and looked around. Beside him lay 4 dead men whom he had just killed with his own hand without even realizing it. The rest of the night passed peacefully. The sun has already risen outside, waking up all living things on earth. Yeren's house, fortunately, remained whole and unscathed after the night's fight. The girl had already woken up a long time ago, as she again had a lot of things to do. She went to the door of the room where her father was sleeping and knocked. Dad said she could come in. Yeren entered her father's room from the east and asked if he slept well. She was holding a tray in her hands and said that she had prepared breakfast for Dad. Remembering Once's wild appetite, he looked at his sleeping place and asked his daughter with surprise where the man had gone. Yeren sat down to have breakfast with her father. Bringing a spoonful of rice to her mouth, the girl replied that there was no need to worry about Wansa now. She was upset, because she just drove the guest and the man who saved her out of her house. The girl was really worried about his future fate. Somewhere along the road to the west of Yeren's house, someone was relentlessly speeding in that direction. It was already dawn outside and you could see the green tops of the trees. The man moved very quickly, without stopping for a moment. He pushed off the branches of trees in his path to move even faster. It was Wansu who had left Yeren's house at night. He spent the whole night on the road, but did not stop, moving in a westerly direction. His face showed that the man was very tired, but fatigue was the last thing on his mind at the moment. Wansu replayed the events of the commas that had happened 6 months ago in the bamboo forest in his head. It was noon in the yard, sunlight penetrated through the treetops. A bald man who looked like a monk defended himself against incessant blows. He did not understand why he was attacked and asked the enemy why he did it. His opponent at that moment was a rather young man. It was Wansu, who for some reason was very angry at the bald man, and was relentlessly throwing his punches. So far, the man has managed to block the enemy's blows. He watched his opponent's movements, and concluded that he was young and legal. The bald monk grabbed Wansu's right arm, stopping his blow. while the left hand of the enemy was already approaching his face. The man managed to avoid this attack by Wonsu, grabbing his arm. It was obvious from his face that Wonsu was a strong opponent, and it was not easy to deal with him. Wonsu, in turn, did not stop for a second, attacking the enemy. He struck the next blow with his right leg, which the opponent dodged. The man called Wonsu fierce, like a wild beast. From the blows that the man managed to block, he noticed a red spot on his left hand that was evaporating blood. The bald monk did not understand what kind of magical power it was. Wonsu stopped for a second and his opponent had time to talk to him. He asked why the boy had such a dangerous skill, which he used to harm himself. Wonsu was not going to listen to any arguments from his opponent. He was furious and did not hear anything at that moment. His eyes glowed brightly and demonically. The bald man looked at the face of his opponent and realized that talking to him would not bring anyone a positive result. He was shocked by the boy's emotions. After seeing the young man's reaction, the man concluded that he definitely had a rhythm disorder. He asked himself if there was any way to save him from this. Wonsu approached his opponent again and delivered a powerful blow. The man managed to block the blow, but he felt the boy's full force on him. At that moment, he concluded that he could not win this fight. Wonsu was about to strike again, gathering energy in his left hand. The boy attacked the enemy's right shoulder with all his might. The bald monk cried out from the pain Wonsu had inflicted on him. His shoulder was excruciatingly painful. Wonsu stopped at nothing. He gathered all his strength in both hands to finally finish off his opponent in one blow. The boy punched the enemy directly in the chest, knocking the man back. The blow was so powerful that it literally made a hole in the monk's body. The man fell powerlessly to the floor and slid across it, counting the pebbles with his spine. Pieces of fabric from his clothes flew in different directions. Wonsu finished the fight and stood over the injured body of his enemy. He said he didn't know why, but told him not to try to kill him again. The bald monk lay on the ground, bleeding. The red liquid was slowly flowing out of his mouth, but he tried to say something last. Drenched in bloody blood, the bald monk still found the last strength in himself to say something to Vans. He said that maybe his disciple Muan could help Vans. Somewhere near the mountains stood a red stone temple. It was winter in the other valley of Nurim. Snow covered almost all surfaces in sight. The man was cleaning the area near the temple. He waved his broom, whistling some tune to himself. There was dead silence around. Suddenly, someone interrupted this man's peace. He turned in his direction, not letting go of his broom, and was greatly surprised. He saw a young man in front of him who was just standing and looking in his direction. He asked him who he was. Wonsu did not want to have a dialogue with the man who was rummaging around the temple. He simply walked past him and headed for the central entrance. The man certainly didn't like it, and he got ahead of Vance, standing in front of him. He shouted that outsiders are not allowed to enter this temple. Wonsu still didn't want to answer the man, and just pushed him away. Falling down, the man dropped his broom. The young man continued his movement towards the central entrance of the temple. The man who had just been pushed by Wonsu shouted loudly that they wanted to invade the temple. As soon as Wonsu entered the temple, he was surrounded by 6 warriors with weapons in their hands. They stood in a circle, in the center of which was the enemy, and pointed their sticks at him. One of them turned to Wonsu, asking who he was and how dare he barge in here unannounced. No one in the temple liked Wonsu's behavior, but the guy didn't care. He said loudly that he did not come here to fight. Wonsu had another purpose for rushing to the temple. Hearing the words of the Godfather's man who had just invaded their territory, the soldiers were very surprised. Of course, they did not believe him and did not lower their weapons. In order to earn the others' trust, Wonsu fell to his knees, showing that he really wouldn't fight anyone. He said that he came to this temple for help. Warriors with sticks became even more entangled in the enemy's Slovak. They looked at each other and could not understand what this stranger needed from them. Inside the building sat an old wise monk. His head was shaven to a shine, a strange necklace hung from his neck, and he sat in the lotus position, meditating with his eyes closed. There were books on one of the tables in the temple. Sunlight penetrated the building, illuminating the entire area with its rays. An old monk was sitting next to a majestic statue that was above him. He repeated the pose of the statue and sat exactly like it. A young man came to his room and bowed his head, greeting the wise. It was Wonsa who was finally able to get to where he was going from the beginning. The old monk sat motionless in his place without opening his eyes. In a calm and quiet voice, he asked the man why he was looking for him. Wonsa wasn't going to rush to answer. He tried to calm down as much as possible and give an accurate answer, asking for help. The monk did not wait for an answer. Rising from his position, he said that if the man was in doubt, he had better come next time. Realizing that the monk would not tolerate all his antics, Wonsa decided to say everything briefly and clearly. He pointed to himself, and asked the old man to release him from this body. The old man looked at the young man sitting in front of him, and with surprise asked about the release. He added that he cannot help a sinner who causes much harm to others. The man on his knees began to beg the old man for help. The monk moved towards the exit, saying that he would not listen to Wonsa and ordered him to get out of here. The young man was in complete shock. He did not understand why they were treating him like that, because he was not guilty of anything. He just wants to be helped. The old monk approached the exit, where one of his charges was waiting for him. He told him to see off the uninvited guests, to which the ward agreed. At this moment, Wonsa could no longer contain his emotions. Kneeling in front of a large statue, he hit his head directly on the ground. Blood began to flow from his forehead. It was the cry of the soul of a man who didn't know what he needed to do to be persuaded to help him. The old monk was very angry at the thoughtless actions of the guest. He shouted loudly at the man and asked what he was doing anyway. Kneeling down and looking at his blood dripping onto the floor, Wonsa said he couldn't get out of this hell on his own. He raised his head and looked straight into the eyes of the old monk. Van's face was dripping with blood from his forehead. He said that the monk was his last chance for help. Even further to the west, at the height of the tops of leafy trees, was the residence of the Murim clan. Stairs leading down to it led down many tens of meters. Elder Murima was in this magnificent building. He lay in his bed, dripping with sweat. His name was Jiam Unsan. His wards entered his room and addressed their elder. Standing over the old man's body, they asked Mr. Hym how he was feeling. Barely opening his eyes, the old man said that he would probably not attract the season. He tried to squeeze out a few more words. One of his wards listened carefully to his elder, and understood what he was leading to. He even raised his hand, offering himself. But the old man said that there was no one to hand the Murim over to him. The man was very surprised by such words, opening his eyes wide. Elder Hym continued to speak without opening his eyes. He said that by his will he is cancelling Murim's post as chairman. These were the old man's last words, spoken aloud by him. After them, he weakly lowered his hand on the bed rail. His wards noticed this and rushed to help their elder with shouts. They wanted to somehow save him, but it was already too late. Everyone ran up to him, except for the man, who was not satisfied with the old man's decision. He silently thought that it would be better for the old man to just die without saying anything. Another man with red hair and a beard inquired about their future fate. He asked what will happen now with the post of head of Murim. All the men who came to the late chairman's room stood in a circle, intending to discuss their further actions. One of the honorable gentlemen suggested Mr. Baiwan from the Huangbo family for the post of chairman. He was standing right next to him, and was pointing at the man in the yellow robe. The red-haired man added that Mr. Baivan served Mr. Hym faithfully. Moreover, he is a person without flaws in origin, character and martial arts. Mr. Baiwan was very impressed by such praise from others. He was pleased to hear that, but one of the men who were in this room expressed his dissatisfaction. He said he was against Bivan's candidacy. Bikvan was furious. He almost got his way, becoming the head of Murim, until some scoundrel decided differently. The man folded his hands together in respect and added that he agreed that Mr. Baiwan and the Huangbo family had been loyal to Murim and had done a lot for the clan. Turning to face the rest, the man added that despite this, the mage had weakened and there was no longer an external threat, so he believed that Murim no longer needed a head. Another gray-haired man in the circle agreed with this sentiment. He said that Mr. Jim himself did not appoint the next leader so as not to sow discord in future generations. The man in the scarf, who had previously expressed his opinion, turned to face Mr. Bivan. He asked him if he did not think the same. A bald monk standing next to Baiwan said he agreed with that sentiment. He added that they do not need to go against the last will of the deceased chairman. Mr. Bivin, no matter how much he wanted to, also had to agree in order not to arouse suspicion. He said he also fully supports the decision. The next day, Baiwan had already arrived at his Wangbo family. Their palace was located in the depths of a dense forest, and was the tallest structure around. Baiwan had been dousing his grief with booze since the very morning. He did not understand why no one supported him, because he had plowed the Murim clan for 20 years. Out of anger, he broke the bottle of booze he was holding in his hand. It was the desperation of a man who deserved to be the chairman. A woman approached Baiwan and told him to stop drinking, as it made him angrier. The man said that for many years he did everything to make Murim even more powerful. The woman was in a misunderstanding. She asked the man what was happening to him, and why he was behaving so recklessly. Bivin angrily began to answer that in Murima they believe that now is the time for peace and have decided not to elect the next leader. The man had no choice but to put up with it. Out of anger, he clenched his fist in front of him as hard as he could so that the veins on it stood out. The woman took the man's hand and told him to calm down. With a satisfied face, she told the best man that she had a solution to this problem. Mage's residence was far away from the Huangbo family's house underground. Their leader was sitting on the throne. One of his wards was standing next to him. This man began his address to the founder by raising his hands together, wishing him a happy birthday. It was an associate of the chairman. As a gift to their leader, the wards brought a whole tablecloth of treasures. The companion said that this time they robbed the Indok clan, and that's what they managed to get. The leader sat on his throne scratching his beard. His name was John Ikjian. The man replied that it was all very well and asked where Hamusa was now. In their shelter was another less majestic throne. It was made entirely of materials found in the cave. One of his wards approached Chan and knelt on his right knee. He replied to the founder that they had not seen Hamusa today. Hearing his ward's words, Chong became very angry. He didn't shout at the man, but you could see the displeasure on his face. The mage warriors went in search of Hamusa with their leader. They approached some mysterious place and looked at it from a distance. The chairman's associate turned to the founder and asked him to look into it. Chong turned his head in the direction his companion had told him. In front of them was a fortress with stone walls. On one of these walls was the inscription Palace of the Dark God. The companion asked the leader if this is not a place that is forbidden to everyone, and where only the leader can enter. He asked Chong what he was going to do. Leader Mage took a few seconds to think. He looked at the building in front of him, and replied that he would go there himself. He broke into the fortress, opening the entrance gate. Zhang didn't move very fast, wary of the danger around him. He approached the entrance to the fortress itself. The door in it was wooden and Chong immediately decided to enter it without waiting for anything. Stepping inside, the mage leader immediately noticed a girl in front of him, who was sitting leaning on a pillar. Chong immediately recognized that it was Hamusa. He approached the girl and raised his hand to her throat, trying to feel for a pulse. Suddenly, a voice rang out in the building, saying that it was just the effect of the sleeping pill and there was no need to worry. The leader immediately turned in the direction from where he heard the voice. He was furious and asked who dared to do such a thing to his ward. It was Baiwan who slowly stepped out of the shadows. He turned to John and apologized for arranging their meeting this way. Chong looked at the run of the man standing opposite and thought. He had seen him before and asked if he was from Huangbo's family. Baiwan realized that John recognized him. But he still decided to introduce himself as the head of the Huangbo family. Baiwan. John continued to rage at the man in front of him. He shouted loudly and said, "How dare Baiwan come in here?" Without thinking long, Chong rushed to attack his enemy. He was moving towards him, his fists clenched, and he was telling him to die. Baiwan dodged Zhang's double punch and was very surprised by this reaction. He asked the head mage to calm down, but Chong did not want to hear anything from his enemy. He threw his next punch with all his might, which went right into the opponent's hand, who was trying to block the blows. Baiwan had no choice but to resist the attacker. He drank the enemy's blows and tried to explain to him that he did not come here to fight. Chong did not think to believe his enemy. Baiwan noticed a kick that was about to hit him squarely in the head. The head of the Huangbo family managed to block the enemy's dangerous attack in time by putting both hands in front of him, but Chona was unstoppable. He was very angry at what had been done to Hamusa and put all his strength into a blow that landed right in Baiwen's chest. The head of the Huangbo family felt all the power and anger of his enemy on him. He flew back from such a powerful enemy attack. Pushing his opponent back, Chong finally spoke to him. He angrily asked why his enemy did not resist. Baiwen wiped the sweat from his beard and said that he had told his vizier earlier that he had not come to this place to fight at all. Jung finally heard the words of family head Huangbo. In response, he asked why he had come here. Head mage noticed someone else behind him. It was the woman who had come here with Baiwen. She said they came here to offer him a deal. There were two men in one of the squares of the mage group. One of them had just arrived and, bowing to the other, reported that the founder was still absent at the moment. He turned to a man named Shindiheb and kept him busy for a while. He asked if he had seen Mr. Chong at that time. Shin replied that he had not seen him since last night, as he was not there. He added that he probably won't be able to say goodbye to him. Another man answered to say goodbye to Mr. Two women dressed in beautiful green robes were moving along the territory of this square to the entrance to the palace. They looked askance at the men, who were whispering something to each other. The women passed by and headed straight for the entrance to the stone palace. The men did not understand what was happening here, and just looked in the direction of the women. Approaching the guard, the woman said that she would like to say hello to her father. Vartova replied that the founder left yesterday, and has not yet returned. Hearing the words of this woman, the men outside were very surprised. They heard her speak of Chong as her father, and deduced that the two women were the daughters of Chang's founder. The men hurried over to the women, apologizing to him with their hands clasped together. One of them introduced himself as a follower of the Paiksan faith named Shin Han Chu, and the other was a follower of the Quinchal teachings named Ha Jin. The women opposite were a little embarrassed by such an official greeting. One of them replied that it was very nice to meet them and asked the men if they wanted anything. Shinganu started the dialogue with a positive attitude. With a smile on his face, he told the women that he did not even know that the founder was hiding such beautiful daughters from him. Ha Jin also complimented the ladies, saying that it happens to the mage estates every year. But now that he saw such beautiful ladies, he decided to make his visits more often. Women were again embarrassed by such compliments. They replied that the men were flattering them and asked them where the two of them were going. Ha Jin was a bit confused and didn't know how to answer this question. Shingonchu stopped him in time and said that they were just taking a walk. The women began to whisper among themselves. At this time, Ha Jin added that this was indeed the case, and invited the women to keep them company if it did not bother them. One of the sisters asked the other what she thought about it. The other replied that why not take a walk, because they have nothing to do at the moment anyway. Ha Jin didn't want to ask too many questions, but he just couldn't help himself. He pointed to a girl standing aside and asked what kind of girl she was with them. The girl wanted to say hello, but one of the sisters interrupted her. She pointed to the girl with her left hand and said that she was their younger sister. The men turned pale in an instant. They sincerely apologized to their youngest daughter and said that they simply did not recognize her, as she did not look like her father at all. One of the older sisters told the youngest that she could go home, and she and her sister were going to accompany the two men. One of the men asked why she couldn't go with them. Chona's daughter replied that she was actually illegitimately born to a maidservant. The woman added that she did not understand her place and continued to follow them. In addition, she called her youngest daughter very arrogant. The girl did not like such words at all, as you could see from her face. She stood in her place and was ready to fall through the ground. The girl clenched her fists tightly, holding back her anger at both sisters. Finally, the founder of Mage, Mr. Chong, arrived. He looked down on his daughters with fear and confusion in his eyes. His figure looked creepy at this moment. As soon as the father entered the room, the daughters immediately began to ask him why he did not call them with him. Only the youngest daughter restrained her emotions. One of the older daughters got up from her seat and came closer to her father. Looking into his eyes, she asked if he might be worried about something, and if so, they could help. After waiting for a while and catching his breath, Zhang replied in a calm voice that one of his daughters was to lose her virginity today. The daughters were in complete shock, and only the youngest was in no hurry to draw conclusions. The women did not understand what their father was talking about and what he wanted from them. Jung looked at his daughters and decided to tell them everything in detail. Although he also had this, it was necessary for them to understand him. Jung told his daughters that representatives of Huang Bo's family had come to him and made him a certain offer. The man was very angry with them and at first did not believe that this was really their offer. A woman from the Wan Bo family confirmed that they need a girl who can bear the Wan Bo family's child. She spoke completely seriously, showing no emotion on her face. Zhang angrily looked at the woman in front of him and asked why it had to be his daughter. He asked another question, which was whether any other woman could be taken for this matter. The woman from the Wan Bo family replied that then this matter would not make any sense at all. She asked Chan if he would train the child in mage techniques if it was not his blood descendant. The man looked at the woman in front of him with contempt. He considered everything very well in his head and came to the conclusion that he was in a hopeless situation. In turn, the woman continued and said that if they combined the forces of the Huang Bo family and the mage clan, they would be able to expand the Murim and make it great. She added that in the event of a refusal, Chon will eventually reap the rewards of his decision. The man was greatly angered by such words and assumptions in his direction. Unable to contain his anger, the mage leader grabbed the woman who made him an extraordinary proposal by the throat, threatening to die. Chan's movement made the hat on the woman's head jump up. Mr. Bivin was about to intervene in this fight, but the woman stopped him. She told John that she had already risked her life to come to this place, but no matter what, she trusted John's sanity. After listening to the woman's speech, John replied that it was quite amusing. He asked if the woman really believed that everything would be the way she wanted, squeezing her throat tighter. John finally let go of the woman's unfortunate throat. Her body is caught by Baiwan, who says that they only suggested it to him, and asks John to give an answer once he makes any decision. When Wan Bo's family members were about to leave the premises, Jung stopped them by grabbing the woman's shoulder. He knew that they were just pretending to have great intentions, but were actually pursuing their own selfish goals. But despite this, the man accepted the offer from Huang Bo's family. He wanted to see who would emerge victorious from this situation, and of course believed in himself. Having listened to the father's stories to the end, his daughters sat in complete shock. They thought that Huang Bo's family had just lost their minds and asked the father if he really wanted to accept their offer. Zhang replied that if he wanted to become big, he needed to strengthen his position. He once lost to the head of Murim, and now he had a very good opportunity to get rid of his competitors to appropriate all of Murim. The youngest daughter listened carefully to her father and did not contradict him. She understood her father's intentions to become the strongest force in all of Murima. The older sisters, in turn, could not say anything. They didn't understand why father would trust Huang Bo's family since they are known for their dirty schemes. They asked why they should help people like them. Zhang was angry with his children. He shouted back that as soon as Chairman Murim cancelled the clan succession, the Huang Bo family also lost its influence. At the end, the man added that he just needed to wait a little, and then he could trample them. The younger daughter wanted to show her father her courage and devotion. She turned to him, interrupting his cries, and said that she was ready to do whatever her father said. The older sisters turned to face her to see if she was really sure about it, and if she could even do it. They were very happy with such news, because in this way any responsibility would fall from them. The younger daughter continued to say that if she could help her father at least with her body, then she would do anything in her power. The youngest daughter of the mage leader was on her way to the palace. She was dressed as usual in her pink dress and had her usual hairstyle on her head. Huang Bo's family members were watching the girl as she made her way to the front door of the palace. Mr. Bivin said that this time has come. The woman next to him asked him if he liked the girl. Baiwan replied that there was nothing special about her, and added that he would stop at any moment when the woman wanted to. The woman hid her face behind a veil, behind which one could smooth out her false smile. She said that she asked her husband just like that, because she knows that it is all for their common good. Baiwan immediately set off in pursuit of the younger Doka-chan. He ran to that palace as if he was going to do the most important thing in his life. A half-naked girl was already waiting for him in this building. She greeted Baiwan and asked him to call her Sajin. She said she was honored to carry his child. A woman from the Huangbo family stood on the outside of this building and listened to the sounds from inside. Mr. Baiwan and his youngest daughter, Mage, have already started their business. The woman was satisfied, as she understood that her plan was the best for her and her family. The same hideous smile that was hidden behind the veil still did not leave her face. A year later, Sajin was due to give birth. From one of the Mage estates came the loud screams of a woman who was definitely not having the best feelings in her life. It was Si-jin, John's youngest daughter, who was in labor. They were received by two women who did everything possible for the safety of the child and mother. Opposite the woman herself stood another person who was going to receive the child. Finally, she exclaimed that the child was born. Sajin immediately started asking if it was a boy or a girl. The obstetrician replied that a boy had been born. But his face did not show any joy at all. He was going to say something about the child's health. Mr. Zhang stood by and watched the whole process. Seeing the obstetrician's face, he asked him what was wrong with the child. The obstetrician could not squeeze out these words. Chairman Mage decided to check everything himself. He took the newborn baby by the leg and looked at it. The boy was crying loudly, and blood was coming from the umbilical cord. Chong concluded that the boy was born a weakling. Still holding the leg of the child in front of him, Zhang called her a shameful child. He said that nothing can be done here, and this shame will fall on their whole family. Sajin, hearing her father's words, jumped out of her bed. She yelled at her father not to jump to conclusions, and she would raise this child. John gave the baby to the obstetrician. He called it a shame for the whole family, and said aloud that this matter should be entrusted to his other daughter. The child cried loudly in the obstetrician's arms. The man decided to give the innocent child to his mother so that she would calm down a little. A disconsolate mother took her child in her arms. The child still continued to cry incessantly in his mother's arms. Sajin was deeply upset by her father's words, but unfortunately, she couldn't do anything about it. In one of Mage's dungeons, young men were being trained to become the strongest warriors of the dynasty. About a dozen young men trained here. They had a mentor who gave them commands that had to be obeyed without question. Young fighters threw punches in the air in numbers counted by the coach. On the count of 2, a young, thin young man hit the maximum word. His face showed that he was having a hard time, and he sighed heavily with each blow. Hearing the boy's sigh, the mentor approached him and began to read. The young man felt awkward, because this was not the first time with him. The teacher constantly stood over him with a stick and tried to teach the boy to bend lower and bend his knees more strongly in a fighting position. While training the young men, the mentor noticed that someone had visited his shelter. He greeted the guests with honor, and the boys continued training. It was the head of Mage Yung along with the representatives of the Huangbo family. Chong, with some prejudice, looked at how the children were training and asked the mentor if it was them. The teacher of the children's camp replied that this is how it is. Grandsons of the founder and children of clan commanders trained in this place. A woman from the Wabo clan said that Mage's children had indeed grown up healthy and strong. Baivan added to the best man that there are no developmental problems and praised Chan's strong genes. He continued to flatter Chona and said that if the founder had not cooperated with them, they would not have been able to achieve such high results. Zhang stood in thought, scratching his beard with his right hand. He asked if it was really all for the sake of the Mage clan. He answered his own question and said that these boys will become weapons of evil. Taking another look at the young men as they continued their training, Zhang told the godfather that from now on they would call them Wensu. The skinny guy behind everyone was most surprised by this. His posture looked the most insignificant of all those who trained with him. Chief John noticed the boy's strange posture and immediately turned his attention to him. He immediately caught the eye of the slender figure of the young man. The children's teacher noticed that the founder was looking at it blankly. He quickly turned his head and said that this boy was the son of the third daughter. The boy was still training and listening to every word spoken to him. He was so engrossed in the adults' conversations that he fell to the floor. All the adults immediately paid attention to the boy's fall. Founder Chan looked at him especially intently. His gaze had despised the boy from the very beginning. Once he looked into John's eyes and was very afraid. Tears appeared in his eyes, because he was very afraid of the terrible uncle in front of him. The boy immediately got to his feet and ran towards his mother. He shouted loudly for help, asking his mother to save him. It was Sajin who was just passing by at that moment. She was shocked by the boy's reaction to his own grandfather. Once it kept running towards his mother, trying to save himself. But John didn't want to spare the boy just like that. He ran after him to catch the young man. He took him by the collar and lifted him up to look into his face. He recognized in the boy the same weakling that he was from birth. Once he shouted that he was in pain and called his mother for help. Sajin ran up to John and fell on her knees in front of him. She begged her father to wait a little, as the boy was still small. The woman asked to leave him alive and said that she would teach him everything. John raised his gaze and directed it towards his third daughter. Above him were the representatives of the Huangbo family, who were also watching this insignificant phenomenon. Chong threw the boy out of his arms and he immediately ran towards his mother. The founder said that his daughter does not even care about her father's reputation. Sajin tried to justify herself, but the father did not even want to listen to it. Seeing the boy, he already decided his fate in advance and was going to give the order. Waving his hand in front of his mentor, Chong gave the order to throw the boy into the cave. Sajin was in complete shock and did not understand how her father could do this to his own soul. The boy was taken from his mother. Sajin begged her father not to send the boy to the dungeon, because he simply would not be able to survive there. She fell on her knees again before her father and begged him for mercy. She said that she was ready to give up everything for this, just to save the boy's life. Zhang replied that it should have been thought of earlier. He threw his daughter away from him and cut off that he did not need such scum like this boy in the army. He turned to the rest of the young men and warned them that in fact weakness and worthlessness equals death. Future warriors clearly understood their boss. Bai Wan and the woman from Huangbo watched and listened to everything that happened around them. So far, everything was going according to their plan. On a slope in the valley was a deep and eerie cave. The entrance to it was winding and had many obstacles. Trees grew near it. Wansa was dragged into this cave by the collar. He was put to sleep so that the boy would not resist on the way to the cave. Already on the final stretch of the journey, the young boy came to his senses. He slowly opened his eyes and realized that it would be better not to do this at all. One of Chan's followers held him by his clothes just above the bottom of the cave. The guy just realized what kind of trouble he got into, but there was nothing he could do. The man threw Wansa straight into the deep hole and he flew to the bottom. The boy shouted loudly, because he did not know what adventures awaited him there. He was rapidly falling down, trying to grab onto something. But the walls in the cave were slippery, and the boy could not stop his fall in any way. Wansa finished his difficult flight and landed directly on the solid ground at the bottom of the cave. He was all tortured and torn. He was in a lot of pain from such a landing. A little came to his senses. The boy rose to his feet. He decided to look around the area, but so far he could only see endless rocks in front of him. Wansa continued to survey the space that now surrounded him. Suddenly, he came across the skeletons of dead people right in front of him, and was very scared. The boy shouted to the best man that he wanted to go home to his mother. In an instant, the figure of his mother appeared in front of him, behind which stood two more men. The woman approached the boy and kicked him directly in the chin. She shouted that there was no mother here. Wansa wept bitterly again. He was in a lot of pain and was holding his chin. He did not understand why his mother was doing this to him. The boy looked into his mother's eyes. The woman's face was serious and creepy at that moment. She said that the boy must survive here by any means. After these words, the woman turned away from the boy and walked away. Wansa was saying something after her and tried to hold his mother back, but she didn't hear him. Suddenly, the boy heard someone's voice behind his godfather saying that they smelled a person. Vaughn was so scared that he didn't even want to go back, but he had no other choice. The boy jumped away from the suspicious voices, falling to the ground, and asked who was talking to him. Looking closer, the boy saw two muscular men in front of him. They said that they did not miss the smell of fresh meat that was lying right in front of them. Wansa quickly jumped to his feet to somehow save himself. He was standing right in front of these two cannibals and was shaking with fear. The boy once again asked the strangers who they were. The two men weren't going to answer any of the boy's questions. They decided that it was time to grab their prey and went after him. The boy still tried to escape from his attackers. As he ran away, he shouted loudly that they would not touch him. Wonsu saw a rock in front of him. The two cannibals were already catching up to him, and Wonsu quickly decided that he needed to do something about it. He jumped over the rock in front of him. The boy thought that hiding behind this stone would be the best solution to avoid death. The men could not understand where their prey had gone, and Wonsu, in turn, sat behind the rock, covering his mouth with his hands. He sat in one place like that, trembling with fear, with the hope that he would not be found here. At that moment, the boy did not think about anything at all, but only about his life. For 3 days Wonsu could not explore the cave in more detail, as he was very afraid. He sat constantly, leaning on a rock, and cried. This is what he was doing now. Suddenly, his crying was interrupted by someone's hand tapping him on the shoulder. The boy was sitting on the ground, hiding his head. Feeling someone's touch on him, Wonsu screamed loudly, because he thought that in the next couple of minutes he would end. The boy opened his eyes and saw a young man in front of him, who was showing him to behave more quietly. He turned to Wonsu and said that he had been watching him all this time. The boy didn't understand what the young man was talking about, and was just shaking with fear, while the green-haired boy asked if Wonsu wanted a drink. Without waiting for the boy's answer, the green-haired young man offered to follow him and pointed his finger in the direction. He added that there is water in that city. He sat on his haunches, looking up. Wonsu was behind, both of them in the middle of the tall rocks. Wonsu did not know what to do in this situation, because now he trusted absolutely no one. He was looking at the green-haired boy who was already climbing up the rock, looking down. Wonsu was very doubtful whether he should follow him. All the same, the young man decided that this would definitely not make him worse and headed upstairs. The boys scrambled up the rock, clinging to the stones with their hands. Suddenly, Wonsu grabbed one of these stones, but it turned out to be unreliable. The stone cracked and the boy screamed, as he understood that it would just fall down. The green-haired youth heard Wonsu's screams in time, and came to his aid. He had already climbed to the very top, and managed to save Wonsu a second before he fell by grabbing his right hand. The boy pulled Vance's arm with all his might, trying to throw him up. Vaughn had no choice but to hang in the air. Finally, the boys reached the place where they were heading from the beginning. Wonsu, seeing water in front of him, immediately ran to it to drink. Suddenly, the green-haired boy noticed something strange ahead. He shouted to Vaughn in time and told him to wait. At the other end of this caddy with water, 2 cannibals were quenching their thirst. They were talking about the same 2 new ones, who probably already had time to die in 3 days. Suddenly, one of the men heard strange noises ahead. He wiped the water off his chin and told his companion to follow him. He asked if someone could really be there. Very young boys hid behind a rock in time, avoiding a meeting with cannibals. The green-haired youth looked out from behind the stone and said that everything was clean and the cannibals had left. As soon as he heard these words, Wonsu quickly ran to the pool of water. He bent down and began to drink steadily, while the green-haired friend only got closer to the water. He turned to Wonsu and said that only the strongest can be found here, since this climb is very steep and not everyone will have the strength to climb here. The boy added that the only way to get here was the one they took. At that moment, Wonsu saw a skeleton floating in the water in front of him, and he screamed loudly. His current friend said that in this area it is not the dead but the living that should be feared. But Wonsu was not afraid of a creepy skeleton at all. He was pointing his finger at something hideous behind his companion. Behind the green-haired boy stood one of the cannibals. His figure looked creepy with a smile on his face. He asked the boy who he was. He continued and said that he looked like the guy who got here last year and was very surprised that he was alive. The cannibal grabbed the victim by the throat. The boy only had time to shout for Wonsu to run away from here as fast as possible. The boy did so, but could not get out. Another cannibal immediately appeared on his path, who with raised hands asked where Wonsu was going to run. He knocked the boy to the ground and laughed demonically. He ordered the young man to sit still, because he had nowhere to run. Wonsu crawled back slowly, feeling the surface beneath him with his hand, hoping to find something that could save him. But he could feel only the abyss with water. The boy fell straight into the water. The cannibal, who had just wanted to kill the child, now wanted to save him, because he understood that he would be left without dinner. Once plunged into a maelstrom that grew stronger with depth. He understood that he needed to escape immediately, otherwise he would say hello to the dead. Wonsu, due to his imprudence, fell into an abyss with water. Without realizing it, he saved his life from a cannibalistic death by his own mistake. He sank deeper and deeper under the water. The boy looked up in front of him and saw his enemy there. He needed to do something to avoid dying underwater. The man holding the green-haired boy by the throat shouted at his partner and ordered him to quickly get the boy out of the water. The man replied that he could not swim. Wonsu continued to sink in the relentless flow of water that engulfed him. At some point he managed to float up. He raised his hands up and loudly called for help. The cannibal standing on land could not cook the boy, as he could not swim. He looked at his prey and wondered what he could do. He decided to give the boy a helping hand. The green-haired boy heard the cannibal's offer and told Vaughn not to fall for his manipulation. He added that if the boy took his hand, he would simply die. That was the last thing on Wonsu's mind at that moment. He needed to save his life right now, as he was drowning, choking on water. The cannibal holding the green-haired boy, hearing his words, punched him right in the face. He called him a creep and said how dare he say such a thing. The other bald man continued to lash out at Wonsu, who was drowning. He said just take his hand and trust him, or the boy will just die in the water. At the last moment Wonsu decided to trust the words of his green-haired friend. He did not grasp the hand of the enemy, and simply went downstream. Fortunately for the boy, there was a skeleton in his path that he could grab onto. He was firmly afloat, so Wonsu couldn't worry about sinking just yet. The cannibals were skeptical of the decision of the young man, who decided not to lend a hand. They were going to watch how long he would last. One of the men offered to wait and get some refreshments for now. He put the green-haired boy on the ground, who passed out from the pressure on his throat. The young man could no longer resist, as he was unconscious. As Wonsu floated in the water, holding tightly to the skeleton, one of the cannibals began sharpening a stone. He did this while sitting on the ground and concentrating as much as possible on the process. In the end, he managed to sharpen the stone to the required sharpness. Now nothing could stop the cannibals from starting their meal. A man with a stone in his hands approached the boy who was lying on the ground. Wonsu noticed the figure of a man approaching his companion and holding something sharp in his hands. The young man screamed as hard as he could, trying to wake up his friend. He told him to wake up and run. The cannibal ordered Vaughn to shut his mouth, as he was annoying him a lot. The man knelt over the boy and raised his hand, which held a sharp stone. Having properly prepared, he hit the body of the boy with all his might with the stone, who was lying motionless. We'd continued to repeat these movements, which sent blood flying in different directions. Wonsu saw all this horror with his own eyes, but could not do anything, since he was in the water. All the boy managed was to shout at the cannibals in response to their actions that they were just monsters. There was a fog over the water in the cave. Drops of water slowly dripped from the sharp stones on the ceiling, filling the puddle more and more. The cannibals lay next to the boy's body and snored loudly. The men did not leave anything alive from the figure of the green-haired boy. Only bones were left lying on the ground, from which blood flowed. Despite his difficult situation, Wonsu also decided to rest in the water, as the previous day had exhausted him greatly. The boy needed to gain strength, which he would definitely need. Suddenly the boy woke up and screamed, as if he had a terrible dream. His face was very frightened by what he saw in his dream. Looking straight ahead, Wonsu realized that it wasn't a dream. He was again frightened by the skeleton of a dead man. But at the same time, he managed to notice one important detail on the skeleton's body. It was a knife that the dead skeleton held in both hands, pressed to its chest. Wonsu carefully looked at the weapon and decided to take it for himself. The young man came up with a cunning plan, thanks to which he will be able to get out of this situation. He pretended to be unconscious, resting his whole body on the skeleton in the water. Then he began to move smoothly towards the shore, where the sleeping cannibals were. Suddenly, one of the men reached out his ugly hand to the boy's head. He took the boy by the throat and lifted him above him. He was pleased with his catch and exclaimed that he had finally caught this rat. The other man, who was still asleep at that moment, woke up to the loud screams of his partner. He noticed that he was holding the boy and said that he was right, that it was necessary to wait a little. The man holding Vansa by the throat was pleased. He turned to face his partner and said that he is always right. But suddenly a wound opened on his neck. The cannibal fell to his knees and began to bleed. His brother quickly ran to him and asked what happened. The man sighed heavily and replied that it was the same boy. He pointed to the boy who was lying motionless on the ground. Wansa pretended to be unconscious again so that no one would touch him at this moment. The man approached the boy and began to look closely at his body. He did not understand the words of his brother, who pointed out to him the boy. The cannibal could not understand what was wrong with this young man. Suddenly everything became absolutely clear to him. Wansa waited for the right moment to launch his sneak attack, and finally he did. He stuck the knife straight into the enemy's throat with more force. The cannibal was shocked by this turn of events. He managed to push the boys away from him, but the pain was very strong and the wound was deep. A man wounded in the neck fell helplessly to the ground. In such conditions, he could not do anything and simply sighed loudly from the unbearable pain. Blood flowed from his wound. Wansu rose to his feet and went to his knife, which he had borrowed from the skeleton. He dropped it just as the enemy struck. The boy took him back to his place. The boy turned his head to the side to assess the situation around him. He noticed the ribcage of his green-haired friend, who was not allowed to eat dinner yesterday. The boy was horrified. Also, Wansu was very angry at the cannibals who had done this to his friend. He was holding a knife in his right hand and was approaching the wounded man. He, in turn, loudly asked for mercy, but Vans didn't care. He understood who he was dealing with, so he didn't wait a second. He rushed at the enemy with a knife in his hands and began to cut his body into pieces. The boy continued to sit on the cannibal's body, relentlessly striking the body with a knife. He had managed to deal with one cannibal, and now he was doing everything possible to finish off the second. Suddenly, the boy felt a powerful blow from a stone, which hit him right on the head. Wansa didn't even have time to get scared, but already received such damage. It was another ally of the two who killed Wansa. The boy fell to the ground from a heavy blow to the head with a stone, hitting his face on the ground. The man who struck Wansa was talking to someone else. He did not come here alone and reported to another ally that there was no one else around. The fat man heard his ally. He stood over the body of the defeated boy and asked him if he had killed those two. Wansa turned to face the enemy, but did not answer. He was going to stab this man as well. But the latter overtook him, kicking him right in the chin. The boy dropped his knife again. Now he was lying on the ground, bleeding from his face. Another enemy stepped on his head, holding him and showing his supremacy. The fat, creepy man concluded that it was all such a small person who killed those people. He said that he was still very young, and he had already tasted the taste of blood. The man standing on top of Wansa continued to press his foot on his face. The boy's face did not look very good. The cannibal asked how the boy tasted blood. Suddenly, the fat man said to let the boy go. The other was surprised at first, but still decided to do as the fat man said. Wansa quickly slipped out from under his feet and stood in a battle stance facing his opponents. Zorodavan mockingly told the boy to at least try to get closer to him. He looked down on the child, showing his superiority. Wansa still stood motionless in one place with his arms out to his sides. He was very angry with these men, but he could not do anything about them, since the forces were unequal. At some point, the guy decided to just move his legs. The fat man reassured his partner and told him to leave the boys alone. He was sure that they would meet him again, but now they needed to get rid of the bodies. Wansa walked around the cave day and night in search of food. He already knew where he could get water, but food was more difficult. Suddenly, he saw two bats above him, hanging upside down. One of them saw the boy and instantly decided to fly away from trouble. In order not to frighten the animal too much, Wansa slowly lowered himself to the ground and reached for a stone lying nearby. He tried to keep his eyes on the bat, keeping it in his field of vision. Having chosen a suitable moment, the boy threw a stone with all his might in the direction of the flying beast. He managed to kiss the animal directly in the stomach, which made the bat scream. Impressed by his prey, Wonsa quickly ran up to the bat. He took it in his hands and examined in detail the place where he had hit with his throw. The boy already understood that even in this cave the strongest survives. Therefore, he was no longer disgusted by anything and began to eat the raw meat of a still living bat. Wonsa was no longer frightened by the cries of animals. Almost 6 years passed, and someone's life was still boiling in the cave. 2 young men were making a fire right in the middle of one of the parts of the dark cave. They were frying something aromatic and tasty. Then one of the boys called the other to him and said they had to go. According to the young man, they had already lit a fire and roasted something fragrant. Literally after a couple of tens of seconds, 4 cannibals appeared on the horizon. They came to a fragrant smell that could be heard from this side. The men noticed a fire in front of them, which was still burning. Without thinking for a long time, the men rushed towards the aromatic meat. They thought that luck just smiled on them. One of them warned that they must first deal with those who prepared it. Out of nowhere, a wild animal ran out, clearly displeased with the men's loud behavior. He ran towards them and roared loudly. The men did not have time to figure out what was happening here, as a wild beast, similar to a wolf, attacked one of them and began to eat. Everyone was in complete shock and horror at what was happening. The men realized that they could no longer save their comrade, so they rushed to run in the other direction from the wild beast. Someone was carefully watching them from above. It was Wonsa who managed to survive in the cave for 6 years. Now he wasn't just a little boy who was afraid of everything. He was about to jump down. Descending from the mountain, Wonsa headed in the direction of the wild beast. The cannibals heard someone land on the ground and turned. They were surprised and asked each other who it was. A second before he collided with the beast, Wonsa stopped. The wolf-like animal was not going to just watch the boy and rush to attack him, but Wonsa did everything not just for fun. He had a clear plan that he followed. The boy ran in the direction of one of the uninvited guests. The man saw Wonsa running right behind him, followed by a wild beast. He shouted and called the boy crazy and asked what he was doing. They all ran so fast, they didn't even notice the fire in front of them. They managed to stop literally a meter away from the burning fire, in which someone was already burning. Without thinking long, Wonsa kicked the man standing in front of him with his mouth open and sent him straight into the flames. The man began to burn and scream loudly in pain. In 6 years, the little boy's mind and behavior have changed a lot. Now he could think calmly in a critical situation. Wonsa bent down to the floor and picked up the lunch that the young men had prepared for this. It was a leg of meat on a wooden stick, which madly attracted the wild beast. He could smell her and looked at the boy who was holding the meat and growling. Vons did not have time to stay in one place. Therefore, having irritated the beast, he quickly ran towards another man. The boy held the meat in his teeth, and a wolf-like beast followed him. The man kept backing up, kicking his feet, until he rested against the rock behind him. He shouted loudly so that the boy would not dare to approach him. Of course, Wonsa had his own plans for this. He wasn't going to listen to the cannibal in front of him, and moved relentlessly towards him. Having come as close as possible to him, he stepped on his shoulder. The boy pushed himself away from the man's body and climbed up. He was still holding a piece of meat on a stick in his teeth, and was trying to grab hold of the rock. Vons managed to escape from the wild beast, and at the same time to get rid of another enemy. He climbed the mountain and watched the action from below. The wild beast had already got hold of human flesh and began to devour it relentlessly. The man shouted loudly and looked in the direction of the boy on the mountain, asking for help with his eyes and cries. Of course Wonsa wasn't going to help him. His plan worked as well as it could and he stayed alive and with lunch too. In addition, the boy managed to get rid of as many as 4 competitors in the cave. A woman stood at the entrance to the cave from above. It was Sajin who watched her son and marveled that he had managed to survive in the cave. She thought that now he had only one choice. 2 guards stood at the entrance to the mage clan's secret facility. The sun shone very brightly today, creating shadows from the columns on the stone floor of the palace. The guards stood motionless, looking around. Suddenly, their peace was interrupted by a woman who quickly moved towards them. The men were in a misunderstanding. That woman was Sajin, who had finally reached the palace. The guards turned to her and asked what business she had come for. The woman replied that she had seen the robbers nearby. The men were shocked. One of them asked where they were now. Sajin pointed in the direction with her hand, to which the man replied that they would immediately go check everything. The other guard wasn't going to go anywhere without a weapon in hand. Sajin tried to dispel any doubts in the guards' minds. She said in a frightened voice that she had indeed seen the robbers, and asked the men to go there as soon as possible. After these words, the guards stopped muttering and went on their way. Sajin breathed a sigh of relief as she finally managed to outshine these men. She approached the central entrance to the building. The woman carefully looked around her, shaking her head in different directions. She did not want anyone to see her in this place. After making sure that the surroundings were completely empty, Sajin decided that the time had come. She slowly put her hand to the door and opened it. The woman went inside the building. She had to do something important and urgent here, so she immediately hurried. Until the guards returned, she needed to do everything quickly. She hurried to the library and took one of the books. She then headed east, which led directly to where she had been heading from the beginning. The future generation was training on the battlefield in the Mage Palace. At that moment, a battle broke out in the arena between several pairs of warriors. One of the couples was a brunette and a blonde. The boys were as focused as possible on their battle. None of them wanted to lose to their opponent. Having delivered a couple of blows, which were blocked by the opponent, the blonde decided to attack the opponent with a chop on the legs. He rushed to the floor, but the brunette managed to get up in time. He didn't just jump up, he had his own plan. He immediately turned his defense into an attack and moved in the direction of his opponent, clenching both fists. Sajin just came to the battle arena and watched the training of these two warriors. She was surprised by the skills of the young boys who competed with each other. The blonde managed to block his face's attack from above. He put his hands out in front of him and grabbed the limbs of his opponent, trying to restrain them with all his might. His face showed that it was not easy. The brunette turned out to be a little stronger than his opponent. He destroyed the enemy's block and performed a double punch with his hands, spinning them in the air. The attack was quite strong. From her, Blondin flew weakly back to the ground and began to sigh in pain. But another surprise awaited him. While his opponent was sliding on the ground, the brunette rose up so his opponent wouldn't be able to spot another attack. With all his might, he delivered a knee strike from above directly into the face of his opponent. They were trained by the same mentor who was there 6 years ago. He praised the boy who had won and said that he would be very good at the Mage Clan's investigation. Sajin watched all this in silence. She didn't want anyone to notice her and suspect something. The woman took out a notebook from her sleeve, which she had recently read in the library. After training, the mentor sat at the table with a man. The latter said that today he was convinced how unique these children are, and the Mage Clan will soon be able to conquer the whole world. The teacher replied that these children still have a lot to learn. The bald man with a short mustache added that it was all thanks to the man across from him. The mentor told the interlocutor to stop flattering him and offered to drink better. After drinking a glass of fragrant mulled wine, the men smelled a pleasant smell. Mrs. Sajin approached them and offered a good snack for a good feast. She put a baked chicken and vegetables on the table, the smell of which spread throughout the room. Sajin said she made this dish to thank the men for their work. The men were shocked by such kindness from a noble family. They thanked the woman for the fragrant dish and began to eat. Several hours have passed, and only the bones of the chicken remain. The men started a very loud conversation, however, when one of them took some bastard by the head. Without realizing it, Sajin joined the men and drank with them. The bald man continued his story and said that he had broken the student's head. The teacher mockingly replied that he was merciless. Afterwards, Sajin asked the men for their opinion on which Mage Clan's martial art was the most outstanding. The bald man with a mustache was the first to think and told the woman that it was the devil's sky and stars. The teacher opposite disagreed with the interlocutor's opinion. He said that he thought it was a divine void blood devil. Sajin listened to the men's conversation and asked herself questions about each of these techniques until she understood nothing. The bald man asked if this was not a technique that had been banned 1,000 years ago. He wondered why this martial art of the Mage Clan was banned. The children's teacher replied that it was very dangerous. Sajin still sat motionless in her seat, resting her chin on her right hand. The teacher continued by saying that if you master the skill, you can become the best warrior, but to withstand this power and not die is too difficult. At these words, the woman began to listen more carefully. The teacher went on to say that if the ritual is still completed, then a person will know the power of the devil. Sajin continued to listen intently. The men discussed the possibility that the founder knew how to gain such power, but they would never know, and even if they did, they wouldn't be able to learn. Sajin remembered her childhood. One beautiful sunny day, she and her sisters were playing hide and seek. One of them started reading until 3, and the others ran away. Sajin herself ran to the left. They went their separate ways with the other sister, not noticing as they were focused on the game. The little girl ran as fast as she could to the forest so that it would be more difficult to find her here. She wanted to hide in such a place to definitely defeat her sisters. She ran for the obstacle behind which she planned to sit. Little Sajin kept turning around to make sure no one had found her yet. The girl decided to hide behind one of the trees in the forest. She sat quietly so that no one could hear or see her, and suddenly she saw the figure of a man in front of her. It was her father, the head of the mage family, John. He was slowly heading somewhere, proudly holding his head high. He arrived at the place where he needed to go. He pushed aside the grassy plants on the ground and reached for a wooden door right in the ground. At this time, little Sajin was watching her father from the shelter. She noticed that John was going into some secret entrance underground, and she became very curious. The head of the mage clan was about to descend. Directly under the ground there were wooden stairs that led down. The man took the first step forward. When Jung had already gone down deeper, little Sajin decided to come closer and look into this secret cave. She saw her father coming down the stairs. John arrived at his destination. He was going to visit an old man who was chained in this cave. Approaching the old man, John told him that he had a rather long name. Grandfather, who was chained by throwing chains for all his limbs, was not very happy to see Chan in front of him. Seeing his figure in front of him, the old man spat in his face. If he were not bound, he could not only spit. He called Chan a bastard and told him to die. The man was very old and had spent many years in this cave. Jong wiped the drool from his face and said that the old man had learned the Murimi clan's forbidden technique, and had committed a great sin for selfish purposes. For this he was to be severely punished. Chong added that besides this, the old man had defiled this martial art. He raised his hand to his grandfather's chest, and said that his body would have to pay for it. All this time, little Sajin watched and listened to the men's dialogue. She followed her father from the very beginning and heard everything with her own ears. Now, years later, she finally understood what his father had been talking about with the chained grandfather. One idea came to her mind. At that time Wonsu was sitting in the cave where he was sent to die. He managed to survive alone and was now eating a bat that he had recently killed with a stone. Suddenly, someone interrupted the boy's meal. Wonsu turned his face to where he heard the strange noises and saw a figure in front of him. Wonsu didn't even have time to think when the man in front of him hit him right in the neck with a stick. The boy did not expect this, so he did not have time to do anything. Sajin descended into this cave to retrieve her son. She took 2 strong men with her to help her in this matter. The woman ordered them to follow her and drag the boy with them. She found the ancient cave where her father used to go down, and now she was heading there herself. Sajin came straight to that chained old man. The men threw Wonsu's body on the floor and disappeared. The woman told the old man that she came here to fulfill his wish. The old man looked straight at the eternal woman and asked what she was talking about. He did not understand what his interlocutor was leading to. Sajin pointed with her hand at the body of the young man, who would be lying heavily on the floor. She said that if the old man taught him a forbidden technique, she would relieve his torment forever. The old man did not take these words seriously. He laughed loudly at the whole cave and coughed in pain at the same time. He replied that what the woman suggested required putting his whole life on the line, and the cowardly John Okjong didn't even try. Sajin was by no means surprised by the old man's words. She calmly nodded her head and replied that she knew about it, because it looked a lot like her father. The woman's words made the old man think. He was shocked when Jung Egjian's daughter walked up to him. He began to think aloud that if this woman came to him and asked for such a favor, Then the boy lying on the floor had become an exile from the mage clan. After finishing his speculations, the old man asked the woman if she really wanted him to save this boy by learning the forbidden technique. Sajin answered positively. The old man once again looked in the boy's direction and laughed loudly. He said that if this boy could still master this technique, he would like to see Young Ok-jong's face. Grandfather in chains still agreed. Literally after a couple of seconds, Wonsu was already sitting in the lotus position, evaporating a liquid of a strange color from his body. The pores on his back were open and steam was coming out incessantly. So far, the boy felt absolutely nothing. The old man then proceeded to the next stage of learning this forbidden technique. He released a stream of blue energy from his mouth, which instantly took the form of an arrow. The flow of blue energy was meant for young Wonsu. Feeling this rush, the boy opened his eyes wide and did not understand where he was. He knelt down, raising his hooks up, and began to scream loudly. His body became covered in veins as the skin began to evaporate into the air. The boy extended his hand towards Sajin and begged for help. The woman was shocked, because she imagined this learning process a little differently. Sajin turned to face the old man and asked if the boy would die from this. Grandfather replied that he has very weak blood and may not be able to handle such a force. He added that if the boy does not manage to cross this initial limit, then there will be no sense in all of this. Wonsu was writhing in pain in his hands. His veins were literally climbing a mountain. From powerlessness, the boy began to simply beat his head on the floor, emitting blue energy. He could no longer bear this excruciating pain. This process was completed and Wonsu fell powerlessly to the floor, sprawled his body, and passed out. His head was bleeding from previous blows to the ground. The boy's screams attracted the attention of the men who had been helping Sajin from the beginning. They came back here again, and one of them sat over Wonsu's body. He tried to feel for his pulse, but found none. Realizing that the boy was no longer alive, the man shouted about it to the others. But suddenly Wonsu's hand came to life and grabbed the man. He shouted again so loudly that it sent a sound wave throughout the cave. Sajin and the old man looked at the young man in surprise and expected to see the result. Wonsu got up from the floor and sat down. His figure now looked powerful and ungainly. His aura turned bright blue, and the boy was still panting from what he had just experienced. The old man, bound in chains, looked at the young man with a satisfied face. He thought to himself that there was a lot of energy in the boy's body, and he still managed to master the Divine Void Bloody Devil technique. After a long and painful procedure, Wonsu finally stood up to his full height. The figure of the young man looked promising. A blue energy hovered in the air around him. Suddenly, the boy noticed a snake lurking around the corner. Having just seen the animal and heard its hiss, Wonsu cut the snake in half with the speed of light. Sajin watched the boy and was pleased. She ordered the man standing next to her to prepare for the next training session. He replied that he would do so. The chained old man looked pleased. He said that he had given the young man all the knowledge, and now it was time to fulfill his own wish. But Sajin had other plans for this. She turned her head in the direction of the old man and told him to calm down and wait, as he would still be useful to her. The old man was shocked by the woman's words. He raged at her, loudly calling her a bitch, because she had promised to fulfill his wish in exchange for hers. Suddenly, Vons got tired of the old man's screams and decided to put him to sleep. He hit the man in the chest area with all his might, opening a wound from which blood began to spurt incessantly. And Sajin did not expect such actions from the boy. She stared at the gruesome picture in front of her with horror on her face. Once it hit so hard that he opened a hole in the old man's body. He punched through his ribcage, extending his hand from the other side of his body. The old man definitely did not expect this from Wonsu, but he could not do anything, because he was bound by metal chains. All he could do was sigh heavily in pain. Sajin was in complete shock. She stood as if buried and watched the old man, who was bleeding. Almost 10 years have passed since this event. Wonsu turned into a real man, and became even stronger than before. Wonsu attacked a man who was passing by the forest, and kicked him hard in the chest. The enemy flew back, knocking down plants on the ground along the way. He managed to twist in the air and land on both feet. Taking out his sword from behind his back, he turned to the man who attacked him and said how dare he attack the shaman. But Wansa did not care at all about this man's situation. He was staring coldly in his direction, his fingers clenched. The opponent was approaching Wansu, holding a sword in his hands. He was going to attack the man, asking him who he was on the way. The enemy was getting closer and closer to Wansu. Approaching the right distance, the man was going to deliver a fatal blow to the enemy, but Vans managed to easily avoid the enemy's direct attack by moving to the left. The blade of the sword passed the man's body and he was about to counterattack. In a second, Wansu was already close to the enemy's head. He hit him hard in the face with his left hand. Wansu did not stop there and decided to finish off the enemy once and for all. He gave him a kick, which pressed the opponent's body to the ground. The man's face met the floor hard. The blow was so strong that the man spat blood from his mouth and cried out in pain. Suddenly Wansu heard the cries of children on the side calling for their father. The man turned to look at the children. He saw in front of him two barefoot girls who were shaking with fear. Now they had to worry not only about their father, but also about themselves. Their dad quickly stood up and grabbed Wansu's knee. He told the enemy not to touch the children, and told them to get their feet out of here as soon as possible. But Wansu wasn't going to listen to anyone. In 10 years, he turned into a real killing machine. He struck the man, causing blood to fly in different directions. The little girls watched the torture their father went through to save them. They saw everything with their own eyes and began to fear even more. They saw before them the demonic figure of a ruthless man. He was covered in blood and his face showed no emotion. Wansu remembered Sajin's words telling him that no witnesses should be left at the scene. But he felt very sorry for the little girls. He looked again at the children in front of him. The girls held each other and cried bitterly, asking the man not to do anything to them. No matter how bitter it was for Vans to do it, he still decided that the worlds would be superfluous. He mercilessly took the lives of very young girls, shedding blood. Wansu told this story to the monks at the temple where he came for help. He looked at his hands and said that he had killed a lot of people in this world. The monk stood behind the man and listened attentively to his story. Wansu added that he even killed a monk once. The men were shocked by the killer's words. One of the monks, having just heard these words, became very angry. He turned to the other, asking if he heard. Wansu turned his head back a little to observe the behavior of the monks. He understood very well that his words made his situation worse, but he tried to be as honest as possible. A monk with a stick in his hands was moving towards Wansu. He shouted that a man is worse than an animal and asked how he even had the courage to appear in this sacred place. He was getting closer and closer to Vans, who was sitting motionless in one place. The man shouted loudly that he would take revenge on him for the monk's death. Wansu understood that he fully deserved such treatment on his side, so he decided to accept everything. Suddenly, this man was stopped, and his stick stopped centimeters from Wansu's head. It was an elder who was in charge of this temple. He turned to the man who came to help him in his sacred vow. He said that if the man came here by himself and to the monk, then the monk he killed sent Wansu to this place. The man who had just wanted to hit the uninvited guests became very angry. He did not understand why they should help someone who killed one of the monks. The elder replied that the boy could not cope on his own, so he was asking for help. He turned to Wansu and told him that he would not take revenge on him, but that he must be willing to die in order to fulfill his as yet unfulfilled dream. The men moved inside the temple. In one of the rooms, the first procedure was waiting for Wansu. 3 scented candles were burning here, standing on the table. Wansu was kneeling right in the middle of the room. His hands were shackled with metal chains that were chained to the ceiling. Behind the boy was a monk. He was sitting in the lotus position with his eyes closed. The man inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly, drawing the energy he needed to himself. He was preparing for an important procedure, and finally he was properly prepared. At one point, the monk raised his hand and snapped his fingers, showing his readiness. He aimed a couple of precise blows with 2 fingers to Wansu's back. He hit a couple of pain points on the man's body. Wansu felt these blows on himself and cried out in pain. His body even lunged forward, which indicated that the monk felt the right points. Literally a second later, Wansu began to scream loudly and spit blood from his mouth. He felt the full force of the procedure performed by the monk on his back. Veins began to pop out all over the man's body, and the face was no exception. Once his eyes widened and turned black, and he himself began to growl loudly. The anger on his face could be seen with the naked eye. He strained hard and caused the columns that held the shackles to crack under his force. The monk continued his procedure. He brought both movements up and clamped 2 fingers on them, preparing for another touch to the man's body. He again delivered a couple of quick blows to Once's back. The man writhed in excruciating pain, but it was a necessary process to cleanse him. The monk pressed on the final point. His blows were so fast that Once didn't even have time to rest from the pain in his back. The old man finished his procedure with a final touch on the man's back. Once's body jumped up from the monk's last touch. After that, Once's patience broke. He could no longer endure these tortures and began to rage without realizing it. The monk climbed up one of the columns. Once shouted loudly and emitted a powerful force. He wanted to break the shackles that were supposed to hold him back and help him in the healing process. The man hit the monk who was opposite him with all his might. The man in the orange robe did not expect this and did not have time to avoid the attack, so he flew back helplessly. His wards quickly came to the monk, who advised him to stop this procedure, commenting on how dangerous it was. He ordered them to leave the premises immediately. The elder understood that he had not yet completed the procedure, so he was not going to stop halfway. He bent 2 fingers on his right hand again and began to move towards the shackled man. The monk got as close as possible to Wonsu and in the movement extended his hand to the man's chest. Wonsu could not control himself and became very angry. The elder of the temple still managed to reach a point on the man's body. He lightly touched Wonsu's right knee, blocking another flow of energy. After that, the monk climbed up, avoiding the bound man's counterattack. He needed to think not only about the boy, but also about his own safety. The old man landed directly on the ceiling and looked at Wonsu. The boy looked at the monk in return. On his face, you could see veins bulging outward. The monk was approaching the final stage to complete the procedure. He pushed himself away from the ceiling with all his might and struck the boy with 2 fingers right in the forehead. After that, Wonsu fell powerlessly to the ground and no longer resisted. The monk landed on the ground next to the man. One of the elder's assistants immediately ran up to the lying Vans. He began to feel for a pulse and informed the monk that there was none. The old man ordered not to touch the boy. He looked at Wonsu's motionless body and said that he had blocked all 5 of the necessary points on his body, adding that if the boy would be a sinner, then I would die immediately from such a thing. Afterwards, the monk silently began to look at the still body of the boy. He thought about whether he was doing the right thing at all, and decided to leave everything up to God himself. Wonsu was lying on the floor with his mouth wide open. His eyes were blank, and veins were bulging all over his body. He miraculously survived this difficult procedure. Another of the elder's assistants ran to the strange sounds in this room. Seeing a motionless body on the floor, he immediately ran up to it. The bald man stared intently at Wonsu's body. He tried to understand what had happened to him, and why the monk agreed to help this not-so-simple man at all.